Hi everyone, and welcome back to Crime Whisper, the channel you turn to when you're ready to drift into sleep with a mystery by your side. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe to help keep these stories coming now. Settle in, take a deep breath, and let's step into tonight's case 1, the vanishing of Zeb Quinnen. The evening of January 2nd, 2000, 18-year-old Zeb Quinn finished his shift at Walmart in Asheville, North Carolina. He had plans that night. He was going to look at a car with a coworker, 25-year-old Robert Jason Owens. After clocking out, the two met up in the parking lot and left in separate vehicles. Surveillance cameras later captured them together at a nearby gas station around 9:15 p.m. buying drinks and chatting casually, but shortly after they left the station, something strange happened. Zeb suddenly flashed his headlights, signaling for Owens to pull over. He had received a page and needed to return the call using a payphone nearby. Zeb appeared shaken after the conversation. He told Owens he had to cancel their plans and drove off abruptly, even accidentally, rear-ending Owens's car in the process before vanishing into the night. When Zeb didn't show up for work the next day, his mother, Denise Velakis, became worried and filed a missing person report 2 days later. Someone called Walmart, claiming to be Zeb, saying he was sick and couldn't come in. Police traced that call to the Volvo plant, where Robert Owens worked. When questioned, Owens admitted to making the call, but insisted Zeb had asked him to do it. Then came another strange turn. Zeb's car, a Mazda Protege, was found abandoned in the parking lot of a restaurant in Asheville. Its headlights were still on inside. The car was a small, terrified puppy on the rear windshield. Someone had drawn a pair of lips and an exclamation mark in pink lipstick. Zeb's wallet and credit cards were missing. Investigators soon learned that Zeb had recently been spending time with a woman named Misty Taylor. She was in a relationship with a man named Wesley Smith. Someone, Zeb reportedly said, had threatened him over the situation. The page that had startled Zeb the night he vanished. It was traced back to the home of his aunt, Ina Usk. She swore she hadn't sent it. In fact, she said she'd been out that night with friends, including Misty Taylor and Wesley Smith. Even more unsettling, when Usk returned home later that evening, she discovered that her house had been broken into. Nothing was stolen, but drawers were ransacked, and papers were scattered everywhere, as if someone had been looking for something. Despite these leads, the case quickly went cold. Investigators remained suspicious of Robert Owens. He was the last person known to have seen Zeb, and the night Zeb disappeared, Owens showed up at work with noticeable injuries, scratches on his arms, a bruised forehead. He told coworkers he'd been in a car accident, but police found no record of any such crash. Then there was the strange call to Zeb's workplace, the page from his aunt's house, and the cryptic message on the car window. None of it made sense. None of it fit together. Zeb's bank accounts were never touched. He didn't take any personal belongings with him, and the restaurant where his car was found, he wasn't known to go there. And as for the puppy, he had no connection to it, and no one ever came forward to claim it. Detectives revisited the gas station footage, the last confirmed sighting of Zeb, but after he sped away that night, he was never seen again. His car didn't appear on any traffic cameras. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Years past, rumors filled the silence. Some believed Zeb had become involved in something dangerous, something he hadn't shared with those close to him. Others felt certain that someone in his circle knew far more than they were letting on. His family never stopped searching for answers. Investigators continued to revisit the few leads they had. Robert Owens was interviewed again and again. His story never changed, but the inconsistencies remained. The injuries, the phone call, the odd timeline, and yet there was still no proof of foul play, no body, no crime scene, just an endless string of questions to this day. Zeb Quinn's disappearance remains one of Asheville's most haunting mysteries. A wound that time has yet to close. Back to Zeb Quinn, a dark turn, despite the lingering suspicions. No body was ever found, and with no physical evidence linking Robert Jason Owens to a crime, authorities had very little to go on Zeb's mother. Denise Vlahakis never gave up. She remained vocal and persistent, urging the public to stay engaged and pleading with investigators to reopen and revisit her son's case over the years. Theories surfaced again and again. Some believed Zeb had been murdered over his connection to Misty Taylor, that her boyfriend, Wesley Smith, may have orchestrated an attack out of jealousy. Others suspected Zeb had stumbled upon something dangerous, something perhaps he wasn't meant to see. The unexplained break-in at his aunt's home the very night he vanished only deepened the mystery. Then, in 2015, 15 years after Zeb disappeared, everything changed. Robert Jason Owens, the last person known to have seen Zeb Quinn alive, was arrested for an entirely different crime, a horrific one. He was charged with the brutal murders of Christy Shone Codd and her husband, J.T. Codd. A well-known couple in the area only had Owens killed them, but he had attempted to dispose of their remains in ways that shocked even veteran investigators. The violence was methodical, chilling, and calculated, a revelation that forced detectives to take a hard look at Zeb Quinn's cold case once again. If Owens was capable of this, could he have done the same to Zeb? Now under intense scrutiny, Owens was pressed for answers. He had long denied any involvement in Zeb's disappearance, but in 2017, under mounting pressure, he finally confessed. At least in part, Owens told investigators that his uncle, Gene Owens, had been the one to kill Zeb. He claimed the murder was a paid hit, allegedly ordered by Wesley Smith, Misty Taylor's boyfriend at the time, who saw Zeb as a threat due to his growing relationship with Taylor. According to Owens, once the murder was complete, he had helped dispose of Zeb's body, but there were major problems with the confession. For one, Gene Owens had died earlier that same year, taking any first-hand details with him, and most importantly, no body was ever recovered despite Owens's admission. Investigators were unable to find any remains without physical evidence. They couldn't close the case, so Owens ultimately took a plea deal. He admitted to being an accessory after the fact, but was never convicted of Zeb's murder. For Zeb's family, the confession was a double-edged sword. It confirmed their greatest fear, that Zeb had been killed but without a body. There was no peace, no closure, only more questions. Was Owens telling the whole truth? Or had he crafted a story to protect himself from harsher punishment? And what about Wesley Smith? Was he truly behind it? Or had another motive been buried beneath years of secrets? Even now, decades later, Zeb Quinn's disappearance casts a long shadow over Asheville. His name still lingers in the community's memory. A young man who vanished without a trace, with answers that remain just out of reach. His family continues to seek justice, and even though the case remains officially unsolved, they refuse to let his story fade into silence. Story 2. The Tragedy of Mu Chin, Singapore's teenage love crime. On January 19th, 2000, the peaceful neighborhood of Pasir Ris in Singapore was rocked by a tragedy that would soon become one of the country's most notorious teenage murder cases. Inside a flat at Block 562, the lifeless body of 17-year-old Kumara Viren, Mu Chin, known affectionately as Muin, was discovered. What followed was an investigation that revealed a heartbreaking story of young love, jealousy, and betrayal. Muin was a student at a local polytechnic, described by friends and family as cheerful, warm-hearted, and well-liked. She had been in a relationship with 18-year-old Chan Chen. Wai Chan was a part-time waiter, quiet and deeply infatuated with Muin Bate. Their relationship wasn't without problems. Chan's intense jealousy often strained their bond. Friends recalled how arguments would spark when Muin talked to male classmates or spent time with other friends. Despite the tension, the couple stayed together, Chan frequently expressing how much he loved her, even when the signs of possessiveness were growing harder to ignore. In late 1999, Muin became acquainted with another young man. His identity was not publicly revealed, but his presence unsettled Chan deeply. The jealousy worsened Chan grew increasingly paranoid, fearing that Muin was developing feelings for someone else. Then came the fateful day on January 19, 2000. Chan invited Muin to his flat, according to his later statement. The two spent time together that day and shared intimate moments, but at some point, a serious conversation began. Chan claimed that Muin confessed to having stronger feelings for the other boy. The one Chan had long suspected. That revelation shattered him, overcome with heartbreak, rage, and despair. Chan snapped in a fit of emotion. He strangled Muin to death. Realizing the horror of what he had done, Chan attempted to take his own life, but survived. When police arrived, the scene was already marked by irreversible tragedy. Muin was gone. The community was stunned. The case sent shockwaves through Singapore, not only because of the ages involved, but because it exposed the dangerous extremes of obsessive love and unchecked emotions in young relationships. Chan was charged with murder. His trial sparked national conversations about mental health, teen violence, and the warning signs of possessive behavior often dismissed in adolescent relationships. Story 2 continued. The murder of Mu Chin. Love, jealousy, and regret. After killing Mu Chin, Chan Chen-wai attempted to take his own life. He slashed his wrists in a moment of hopelessness, but the suicide attempt was unsuccessful. He spent the rest of the night alone in the flat, sitting beside Mu Chin's lifeless body, surrounded by silence, and paralyzed by the weight of what he had done. The following morning, Chan's mother returned home to a scene of horror. Her son was wounded and dazed. Mu Chin was dead. She immediately called the authorities. Chan was arrested on the spot and taken into custody. During interrogation, he broke down and confessed. He admitted to strangling Mu Chin, citing overwhelming jealousy and a fear of losing her to someone else. The crime shocked Singapore. A promising 17-year-old girl, described by all who knew her as bright, cheerful, and kind, had been taken in an act of rage by the very person who claimed to love her most. Chan was charged with murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of his obsessive behavior and controlling tendencies. They painted a portrait of a young man unable to handle rejection or emotional instability, a boyfriend whose love had turned possessive and dangerous. The defense, meanwhile, pointed to Chan's youth, his emotional distress, and the impulsive nature of the act. They argued it was not premeditated murder, but a tragic, spontaneous explosion of despair. But the court was not convinced given the severity of the crime and the circumstances surrounding it. Chan Chen-wai was found guilty and sentenced to death. The judgment sent shockwaves through the country, sparking intense media attention and public dialogue. The case became a national reckoning, a sobering reminder of the dangers of unchecked possessiveness, emotional volatility, and the fragile line between love and violence in response. Educational institutions and community organizations in Singapore began taking proactive steps. Programs focusing on emotional regulation, healthy relationship boundaries, and early intervention were introduced in schools. Mental health awareness, especially among teens, became a growing concern. Muin's death had become more than a tragedy. It became a turning point. Her family was devastated. Their daughter, full of promise, kindness, and warmth, had been taken in a moment of senseless rage. The grief they carried was deep and unrelenting. They pleaded for justice, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of a society that needed to recognize the signs before it was too late. As investigators pieced together the final hours of Mu Chin's life, a clearer picture emerged. On the morning of January 19, 2000, Chan messaged her, inviting her over. She hesitated. Their relationship had been tense lately, but eventually she agreed. She arrived at his flat around noon. Neighbors later recalled hearing faint laughter and conversation through the walls. For a time, it seemed like a normal day. They spent the afternoon talking, eating, and according to Chan, being physically intimate. But as the hours passed, old tensions resurfaced. Asked her once more, did she still love him? Was there someone else? Muin, never one to lie, told the truth. She had started developing feelings for another boy. What followed was a devastating unraveling. Chan's world crumbled in that moment. He had believed their bond was unbreakable. Even with the arguments, even with the emotional distance, the idea of her choosing someone else felt like betrayal. Witnesses would later report hearing raised voices, then loud thuds, objects crashing, and then silence. In his confession, Chan said he grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her as he begged her to take it back. She tried to calm him, told him she didn't want to argue, but he couldn't stop. His hands moved from her shoulders to her neck. He squeezed, not out of malice, but out of panic, out of desperation. But it didn't matter. Nguyen fought back, scratching at his arms, trying to escape his grip, but he didn't let go, blinded by pain and fury. He kept holding on, until her body suddenly went still. Only then did reality. Hythe collapsed beside her, begging her to wake up, checking for a pulse, but it was too late. In shock, he backed away, thought of calling the police, but fear overtook him. Thoughts of prison, of the death penalty, of everything he had just destroyed. Then, in a final act of despair, he took a kitchen knife and slashed his wrists. The crime scene, an arrest. A nightmare unfolds after slashing his wrists. Chen Wai hoped the pain would end everything, but the wounds were shallow, the agony unbearable, and in the end, his fear of death overtook the crushing weight of guilt. He wrapped his injuries, sat down on the floor beside Mu Chin's body, and stayed there through the night, paralyzed, numb, drowning in horror. He didn't move, he didn't call for help, he simply remained, trapped in the aftermath of what he had done. It wasn't until the next morning that the nightmare was discovered. Chan's mother returned home. After spending the night away, she noticed the front door was unlocked, which was unusual. The flat was eerily quiet. As she stepped inside, she called out for her son. No answer. Then, as she moved through the living room, she saw him. Chan was seated in the corner, his wrists wrapped in makeshift bandages, his eyes vacant, staring blankly at the wall. And then she saw the body. Mu Chin's lifeless form lay just feet away. Her mother's scream echoed through the apartment complex, drawing neighbors out of their homes and prompting immediate calls to police. Officers arrived. Within minutes, they found Chan barely responsive. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him and took him into custody. The crime scene was grim. Mu Chin's body showed clear signs of a violent struggle, bruises around her neck, scratches on her arms, and defensive wounds on her hands. She had fought back. Investigators also found broken objects on the floor, bloodstains smeared on the walls, remnants of both the murder and Chan's failed suicide attempt. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: manual strangulation. Mu Chin had died within minutes, meaning Chan had spent nearly 12 hours in the same room as her body. That disturbing detail painted a haunting portrait. A young man so overwhelmed by shock and denial that he could not move, could not flee, could not face what he had done. Public reaction, shock, grief, and national reckoning. News of the murder spread quickly throughout Singapore. Media outlets followed every twist of the case. Journalists, psychologists, and members of the public all weighed in. How had a once loving teenage relationship turned into such a tragic and violent end? Some saw the crime as a horrifying example of uncontrolled emotions and obsessive love. Others questioned whether signs of danger had been present all along and missed or ignored. Many debated whether Chan had truly snapped in a moment of uncontrollable despair, or if his jealousy had been building into something far more dangerous over time. Nguyen's family was devastated. Their daughter, full of life and dreams for the future, was gone. She had planned to travel, to pursue a career, to live fully, and now all of it had been taken from her in an instant. Her parents pleaded for justice. Her friends mourned the loss of a kind and gentle soul, someone who had so much still ahead of her. The trial of Chen Wai. A nation holds its breath with the evidence collected and the suspect in custody. Attention turned toward the trial. Chan was charged with murder. His confession, the physical evidence, and a clear motive made for a strong prosecution case. But even with the facts on the table, there were still lingering questions. Was this a premeditated act, or a tragic outburst of emotion? Could Chan's mental state influence the court's judgment? When the trial began, The entire country watched closely. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every available seat. Legal experts debated on live television. Public opinion was split, but all were united in the belief that this trial would send a powerful message about the consequences of possessiveness and violence in relationships. In the front row sat Muchin's grieving parents, their faces drawn with pain behind the defendant. Chan's family remained silent, wrestling with disbelief, trying to reconcile the boy they knew with the man now standing accused of murder. The prosecution wasted no time presenting their case. They described Chan's jealousy, his obsession, and his refusal to accept that Muchin was moving on. This wasn't just a crime of passion. They argued this was a deliberate act of violence. The bruises on her neck were consistent with prolonged intentional strangulation. This wasn't a momentary lapse, it was a decision, a conscious, forceful act that ended a life they painted. Chan, as someone who valued control over compassion, who had chosen murder rather than face, rejects in the defense, however, told a different story. They argued that Chan was a vulnerable young man, emotionally fragile, and pushed to the edge by heartbreak. They presented psychological evaluations that suggested he was suffering from severe emotional distress. The crime, they claimed, was not calculated. It was spontaneous. Born out of despair, they pointed to Chan's attempted suicide, not as a means of escape, but as a sign of overwhelming remorse, a testament to the fact that he never intended to kill Muchin. He simply couldn't handle the pain of losing her hand with that. They pleaded for leniency. The defense portrayed Chan not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a deeply troubled young man who had made a tragic, irreversible mistake. They argued that he was overwhelmed by heartbreak and emotional instability, not driven by cruelty. But witness testimony told a different story. Friends of Muchin revealed that, in the weeks leading up to her death, she had become increasingly anxious about Chan's behavior. She had confided that he was growing more possessive, constantly questioning her whereabouts, and becoming suspicious of her interactions with other men. She had considered ending the relationship but hesitated, afraid of how he might react. These accounts supported the prosecution's assertion that Chan's jealousy had been simmering for some time, and that the murder was the tragic climax of a toxic, spiraling relationship. Meanwhile, Chan's own friends and family painted a more sympathetic picture. They described him as a quiet, affectionate person who had always appeared devoted to Muchin. Yes, they acknowledged he struggled with jealousy, but insisted he had never been violent to them. This act seemed out of character, something born from emotional collapse rather than intent. Forensic experts were then called to the stand. They confirmed that Muchin had died of asphyxiation, the result of sustained pressure applied manually to her neck. The marks left behind made it clear Chan had used his hands. He had felt her life slipping away and had still not let go. Experts emphasized that strangulation is a slow, deliberate act. It demands time, conscious effort, and persistence, not the fleeting heat of an impulsive moment. This directly contradicted the defense's narrative of a spontaneous outburst. The trial stretched on for weeks. The question lingered in the air. Had Chan committed premeditated murder? Or was this the outcome of a desperate emotional breakdown? The judge listened carefully, absorbing the evidence and the searing testimonies of both families. The prosecution pressed for the harshest penalty, arguing that the brutality of the act demanded accountability. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for leniency, citing Chan's youth and the emotional turmoil that had consumed him on that fateful night. Chan's parents sat through every session, forced to relive their daughter's final horrific moments. They listened to the details of how she had fought for her life, how she had gasped for air, how she had tried to escape the hands of someone she once trusted. Their grief was immeasurable, but their focus remained resolute. They wanted justice. Chan, for his part, remained mostly silent. His face was often blank, his posture slumped, his eyes rarely lifting at times. He seemed lost in his own head, perhaps already haunted by what he had done. He never took the stand. His legal team advised against it, wary that any emotional outburst might do more harm than good. Instead, the court relied on his recorded confession, in which he admitted to killing Muchin but maintained it wasn't premeditated. As the trial neared its conclusion, the nation held its breath. The outcome would not undo the tragedy, but it would serve as a verdict on what had occurred and perhaps a statement on the dangers of unchecked obsession. The case had sparked widespread debate across Singapore. What defines a crime of passion? At what point does love become control? And when do the warning signs of jealousy tip into deadly territory? On the final day of trial, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters whispered behind notepads. Legal analysts speculated on sentencing, and the families prepared themselves for the verdict that would forever change their lives. The air was thick with tension. Then came silence. The judge, face unreadable, began to speak. He reviewed the evidence, the forensic reports, the eyewitness accounts. Chan's own words. He stated plainly, this was not an accident. It was not a spontaneous act. It was a sustained, intentional killing, rooted in control and jealousy. The courtroom held its breath as he prepared to announce the verdict. Chan Wai sat motionless, eyes fixed on the bench in front of him, hands trembling just feet away. Muchin's parents gripped each other tightly, bracing for what they already knew could never truly bring closure. And then, with a steady voice, the judge delivered the ruling. But this was not a crime of sudden rage, was one rooted in control and possessiveness. The judge acknowledged the defense's plea for leniency, noting Chan's young age and the emotional turmoil he may have experienced. However, he emphasized that taking another person's life, especially in such a cruel, intimate wake, never be excused by heartbreak or jealousy. A quiet sob escaped from Chan's mother as she buried her face in her hands, muffling her cries. Chan, who had been visibly tense throughout the trial, finally lifted his eyes. His face was etched with dread and resignation. He knew what was coming. The murder of Nguyen could not be undone, and the law was clear. Such an act demanded the harshest of punishments. And then, the words fell heavy into the silent courtroom. Chan Wai was sentenced to death. Collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by hushed murmurs as those present struggled to process the verdict. Nguyen's mother broke into uncontrollable sobs, her body trembling with a painful mixture of grief and relief. Her husband pulled her close, holding her as she would the daughter they lost, for the justice finally served, for a future forever. Tikanchan sat still. He did not cry, he did not speak. His head slowly bowed under the weight of the sentence, as if he had always known this moment was inevitable. When the officers approached to take him away, he offered no resistance, no struggle, no defiance, just silence. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Some in the crowd felt a sense of closure, believing justice had been served. Others, especially those who had once known Chan as a quiet, kind boy, were conflicted. He had been barely an adult now. His life was over. The case ignited national debate about toxic relationships, about emotional instability, and about how jealousy can silently evolve into something lethal. It became more than just a courtroom drama, became a warning, a reminder of how easily love can curdle into obsession. A few days later, Nguyen's funeral was held. Hundreds gathered, friends, family, and community members. Her coffin was adorned with white lilies. A framed photo of her smiling sat at the front of the altar, a haunting reminder of the life that had been taken. Eulogies were spoken, tears shed, stories shared, but no words could undo what had happened. No gesture could truly ease the pain of losing a daughter, a sister, a friend. In prison, Chan spent his final days in solitary confinement. Guards reported that he remained mostly quiet, speaking only when necessary. He made no appeals, asked for no mercy. Some believed he was consumed by guilt. Others thought he had simply surrendered to the finality of what he had done. Months later, in the early hours of a still morning, Chen Wai was led to the gallows. He walked in silence, the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor. When asked for any final words, he paused. Then, in a barely audible voice, he whispered, "I'm sorry," and then knit was over the case of Komu Muin and Chan Chan. Why remained burned into the public consciousness? It was more than a tragic love story gone wrong. It was a case study in obsession, in emotional neglect, and in the devastating consequences of silent schools and organizations across the country used the story to educate young people on the warning signs of toxic behavior, on the importance of speaking out, and on the fact that love should never hurt, should never control, and should never kill. Muin's parents carried their grief, but they also found purpose. They became advocates for relationship awareness, speaking in schools and community centers, telling their daughter's story in the hope of preventing another. Their pain never disappeared, but they found some solace in knowing that Muin's name lived on, not just as a victim, but as a reminder. Love should never cost a life. As Lean stepped into the house, she was immediately struck by the horrific sight. Before her, Tung Song's body lay sprawled across the living room floor, soaked in a pool of blood. His face was badly bruised and swollen, and his throat had been slashed so deeply that blood had seeped through the carpet beneath him. The room showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, objects scattered. Trembling, Lean grabbed the phone and dialed the police, her voice breaking as she tried to explain the gruesome discovery. Within minutes, officers arrived, cordoning off the area and beginning a methodical investigation. The initial examination confirmed that Tung had sustained multiple blunt force injuries to the head and face, alongside the fatal slash to his throat, most likely inflicted with a sharp-edged weapon such as a knife. The evidence pointed to a sudden, explosive attack and ambush that caught him in the middle of his morning routine. But what unsettled the investigators most was the absence of forced entry. Whoever killed Tung had likely been someone he knew, someone he had let in. Detective Wang An, a seasoned investigator known for his meticulous approach and ability to dig beneath the surface, was assigned to lead the case. His first priority, speaking to the people closest to the victim. When officers broke the news to Tung's wife, Tan Mi, she appeared stunned, unable to process the gravity of what had happened. Through tears, she insisted that their marriage had been mostly stable, despite the occasional argument. She claimed she had no idea who could have wanted to hurt her husband, but something about her response unsettled Wang. Though visibly emotional, her words felt too measured, almost rehearsed. He took mental note of it, but refrained from jumping to conclusions. Next, Wang turned to the housekeeper, Lian, who had been with the family for over 5 years. She was deeply shaken, her eyes swollen from crying. Lean described Tung as a stern but fair man, and said nothing had seemed out of place in the days leading up to the murder, except for one thing. The day before his death, she overheard him in a heated phone call, his voice raised in anger. While she couldn't make out the full conversation, she believed he had been arguing with a business associate. After the call, she said, Tung had been visibly agitated. Detective Wang began digging into Tung's financial records, and was soon confronted with a tangled web of risky real estate ventures and mounting debts. Although he had projected an image of wealth and success, the truth was far more precarious. Tung had been borrowing large sums from various sources, including disturbingly known loan sharks. Large unexplained transactions had been wired to anonymous accounts, and the pressure from creditors appeared to be closing in. It was becoming clear that Tung's murder might not have been a random act of violence, but a calculated strike, possibly linked to his failing financial empire. Wang paid a visit to Tung's office, hoping to learn more there. He met with Karen Lee, Tung's loyal secretary. Tearfully, she recounted her last conversation with her boss. Just one day before his death, he had seemed anxious, distracted, and reluctant to share what was troubling him. She mentioned an important meeting he was scheduled to have later that week, but she didn't know with whom or what it was about. As Wang combed through company files, more red flags emerged, deals that had gone sideways, lawsuits threatened but quietly settled, and partnerships teetering on collapse. One name kept surfacing. Ko Ming Shunko was one of Tung's closest business associates, a man known for both his charm and ruthless pursuit of profit. He had worked with Tung on numerous ventures, many of which had turned sour in recent months. Wang arranged to interview him at first. Ko was cooperative. He downplayed the depth of their partnership and claimed their working relationship had cooled. He admitted that Tung had recently accused him of betrayal and mismanagement, but insisted he had nothing to do with the murder. Still, Wang sensed unease in his demeanor. Ko's alibi that he had been out of town on a business trip was flimsy, and he struggled to provide solid proof of his whereabouts during the time of the killing. The detective pressed further, delving into Ko's financial records and known associates. It became clear that Ko had much more to lose than he was letting on, and possibly far more to hide. Ko Ming-sheng's background raised serious red flags. He had been involved in a string of questionable business dealings and had several brushes with the law, though none had resulted in serious charges. Could Tu Song have discovered something damning? Had Ko resorted to murder to silence a former partner who had grown too curious? As the days passed, the puzzle slowly began to take shape. Detective Wang remained determined to uncover the truth about Tu's brutal death. But one haunting question lingered. Was this murder driven by financial desperation, personal betrayal, or something even darker? What was clear was that the person responsible was still out there, and Wang would stop at nothing to bring them to justice. The deeper the investigation went, the more complex the web of Tu Song's life became. Detective Wang turned his attention back to Tu's professional dealings, particularly his relationship with his business partner, Ko Ming-sheng. Despite Ko's efforts to downplay their connection, Wang found mounting evidence of deeper entanglements. Ko had been central to many of Tu's real estate ventures, some successful, others disastrous. There were whispered allegations, botched construction projects, defrauded investors, and contracts manipulated through shady legal loopholes. While Tu's finances were crumbling, Ko's wealth only seemed to grow. He had a talent for covering his tracks and protecting himself using a vast network of high-level connections. Tu's secretary, Karen Lee, had witnessed the tension firsthand. She recalled a particularly intense argument between the two men in the days before Tu's murder. Tu had accused Ko of exploiting their partnership for personal gain, while Ko dismissed his concerns as paranoia. But the most intriguing detail came from an event just days before Tu's death. Ko had visited his office late at night. The two men had spoken in private for nearly an hour. What had they discussed? Was it a last-ditch effort to salvage their partnership? Or had it been a final confrontation? Wang's instincts told him that Ko had more to hide, and the cracks in his alibi only made things worse. Ko claimed to have been out of town on business at the time of the murder, but there were no flight records, no hotel bookings, and no witnesses to place him elsewhere. His story was rapidly falling apart. Wang's breakthrough came when he discovered that Ko had recently taken out a substantial loan through an underground lender, notorious for dealing with criminal elements. The funds had been used to buy up several local properties. Wang suspected Ko had been drowning in debt and had leveraged his connection to Tu Song to appear more solvent than he actually was. If Tu had found out, he could have exposed Ko's entire operation suddenly. The motive became clear. Ko had everything to lose: his reputation, his fortune, and possibly his freedom. But motive alone wasn't enough for an arrest. Wang needed something solid. A mistake, a crack in Ko's carefully built facade. While he continued building the case against Ko, Wang also turned his focus back to Tu's home life. His initial interview with Tu's wife, Tan Mei, had left him unsettled. Her reactions had been oddly composed, too controlled, too rehearsed, though she denied knowing about any tension between her husband and Ko. Wang suspected otherwise. Their marriage had lasted over 2 decades, and on the surface, it seemed stable. But behind closed doors, friends and relatives painted a different picture, one filled with arguments and resentment. Many said Tu had grown increasingly obsessed with work, neglecting his family and isolating himself emotionally. Tan Mei, some recalled, had often voiced frustration over feeling like an afterthought in her own marriage. Was there more to her story than she let on? Could the strain in their relationship have played a role in Tu's death? Wang couldn't ignore the possibility with both business and personal motives on the table. The case was growing murkier, but he knew he was getting closer. Someone had silenced the song, and whether it was for profit, out of betrayal, or both, Detective Wang was determined to unmask the killer. Detective Wang decided it was time to look into Tan Mei's financial records. What he uncovered raised more than a few red flags, despite Tu Song's wealth. Tan Mei had quietly opened a private bank account in her own name and had been making large, frequent withdrawals in the months leading up to her husband's murder. The money was being funneled to an unknown recipient, and Wang couldn't help but wonder, what was she paying for? Was she involved in a secret affair? Was she planning an escape from her husband's control? Or had she somehow played a role in his death? As Wang dug deeper, he uncovered something even more disturbing. Tan Mei had recently been in contact with a man named Ong, a known figure in the local gambling underworld. Ong was no small-time player. He was tied to loan sharking and money laundering operations a few weeks before Tu's murder. Tan Mei had met with Ong in a discreet, off-the-record meeting. She claimed it was about a business opportunity, but Wang didn't buy it. Why? Would the wife of a prominent businessman need to meet privately with someone like Ong? It raised a chilling question. Was Tan Mei caught up in a financial scheme that spiraled out of control? Did she owe money or loyalty to someone dangerous? Or worse, was she working with Ong to orchestrate her husband's demise? Each new lead uncovered another twisted motive. Ming Sheng, Tu's business partner, had plenty of reasons to want him gone: financial loss, betrayal, and the threat of exposure. But now, Tan Mei's actions suggested she, too, had something to gain from Tu's death. Was one of them the mastermind? Or were they both part of a more sinister conspiracy? Still, Wang knew that suspicions weren't enough. He needed concrete proof. That proof came from an unexpected direction: forensics. Until now, the investigation had largely focused on business rivalries and personal betrayal, but the murder weapon, the knife used to kill Tu Song, held a vital clue, though it had been wiped clean. Forensic experts were able to recover partial fingerprints from traces of blood on the handle. The prints didn't match Ming Sheng. They didn't belong to Tan Mei either, but they did match on the loan shark. Tan Mei had secretly met. This revelation shook the case wide open. Ong was already known for his criminal ties: extortion, gambling, underground real estate deals. He had connections to violent enforcers who would keel over unpaid debts. Wang realized now that Ong's involvement wasn't peripheral, it was central. But the question remained: what was the connection between Tu Song and Ong? Wang dug into Ong's financial dealings and quickly found what he was looking for. Months before his death, Tu had secretly taken out a massive loan through an underground lender connected to Ong, though Tu initially denied needing such a loan. Records showed that he had made several large repayments to an anonymous account. Just before his murder, it became clear Tu had fallen into debt. He had invested in higher-risk, illegal real estate ventures without his wife's knowledge and had turned to the criminal underworld to cover his losses. And now, the motive began to take shape. Tu may have been preparing to come clean to his wife, or even to the authorities. If he exposed the laundering and the shady deals, it would bring down Ong's entire operation in the eyes of the criminal world. That made him a liability, and had every reason to want him silenced. And Tan Mei, with her husband's empire teetering and debts mounting, she may have seen an opportunity to walk away wealthy and free. The deeper Wang ventured, the more tangled the web became. What began as a seemingly straightforward business murder now revealed layers of greed, betrayal, and underworld ties. Each suspect had a motive. Each thread pulled lead to another. The truth, Wang knew, was close, but it was buried beneath years of secrets, silent betrayals, and dangerous alliances. And he would stop at nothing to uncover it. Detective Wang had once believed this case to be nothing more than a financial dispute between business partners, or the fallout from a jealous spouse. But the deeper he dug, the more disturbing the picture became. This was no longer about mere rivalry. It was about a man who had spiraled into debt so deep He had been forced to swim in the dangerous waters of illegal dealings just to keep up appearances to Song. The victim had lived a double life outwardly. He was a wealthy and successful businessman, but in reality, he had become entangled with loan sharks and illicit money laundering networks. His name had surfaced in underground real estate ventures connected to known criminals, most notably a shadowy figure named Ong, a notorious loan shark in gambling. Syndicate leader Wong's investigation revealed that Tu had sought out Ang for financial help months before his murder, though he publicly denied needing assistance. Bank records showed large, unexplained payments to anonymous accounts. These payments, Wang found, were tied to debts from risky illegal investments moves made behind his wife's back. Wang began to see how fragile Tu's empire really was. He had tried to break away from Ong's network, possibly even considering going to the authorities. If he had done so, it would have brought down not only his own empire, but Ong's entire criminal operation. That, Wang believed, was the real motive. Tu wasn't just a victim of betrayal, he had become a liability. As Wang mapped out the connections, suspicion fell more heavily on Tu's wife, Tan Meal. Initially, she had appeared devastated and cooperative, claiming ignorance of her husband's financial woes, but her story didn't hold up. Wang uncovered that she had opened a private bank account and had made frequent substantial withdrawals leading up to her husband's death. The money had been funneled to Ong, raising serious questions about her role in the unfolding drama. Would a woman of such means deal with a man like Ong? More troubling still was the discovery of burner phone activity the night before the murder. Tan Meal had contacted Ong multiple times, using an untraceable number. While the content of the calls remained unknown, the timing was deeply suspicious. Were they plotting something? Coordinating a hit? Wang had no concrete proof yet, but the picture was growing clearer. The breakthrough came when one of Ong's low-level associates finally cracked. He confessed that in the days leading up to Tu's murder, Ong had become increasingly paranoid. He believed Tu was planning to cut ties, and worse, that he might expose their secret dealings. The associate didn't just implicate Ong in orchestrating the murder. He claimed that Tan Meal had been involved all along. She had helped conceal the crime and had ensured that no evidence would trace back to Wang. Now, the narrative had shifted to Song had not simply fallen victim to a business feud or marital betrayal. He had been targeted in a coordinated scheme. Ong had the means, the motive, and the connections to carry out a clean, silent kill. Tan Meal had the access, the finances, and possibly her own reasons, whether driven by fear, greed, or desperation, to go along with it. Wang realized Tan Meal wasn't just a grieving widow. She had been complicit, perhaps even willing, in her husband's downfall. Maybe she had grown tired of the lies, the financial ruin, the risk. Maybe she had seen an opportunity to escape with her wealth intact, or maybe she had been manipulated all along by someone more powerful. As Wang pieced together the final threads, the weight of the case pressed heavily on him. The murder was no longer a mystery, was the product of greed, deception, and a relentless desire to keep buried secrets from ever seeing the light of day. Fingerprints on the knife, partially recovered from its blood-stained handle, were finally matched to Ong. That single, smudged print became the linchpin in an otherwise circumstantial case. With it, Wang had the physical evidence he needed to bring Ong to justice. But he wasn't done. Wang built the case against Tan Meal next, using the financial records, burner phone calls, and witness statements to expose her hidden role. Though she never wielded the knife, her fingerprints were all over the setup. Financially and emotionally, she had shielded the crime, played her part, and benefited from its outcome. As Wang closed in on both Ong and Tan Meal, he reflected on the twisted complexity of two songs. Life and death behind the polished surface of a wealthy businessman was a man drowning in debt, chained to a criminal underworld, and betrayed by those closest to him. Detective Wang's investigation had finally peeled back the layers of lies, revealing a web of corruption, manipulation, and murder. Justice would be served, but the case left a haunting message behind. Even in lives that seem perfect from the outside, Darkness may be lurking just beneath the surface, Dan. M had always presented herself as the picture of calm and composure, refined, poised, and loyal. But Detective Wang had come to learn that appearances often masked dangerous truths as the investigation progressed. It became painfully clear that Tan had known far more about her husband, To's financial collapse, than she had let on. She had not only been aware of the mounting debts, but had actively helped conceal them. Her ties to Ong, a known loan shark and criminal associate, extended far deeper than anyone initially suspected. Wang's breakthrough came when he traced several large cash withdrawals from one of Tan's private accounts transactions she had attempted to bury under layers of shell accounts and false names. The funds, however, were eventually linked to payments made to Ong's associates. It was clear Tan wasn't just protecting herself from financial ruin, she was helping shield the criminal empire. Her husband had become entangled in whether her actions were motivated by fear, greed, or a toxic blend of both. She had made her choice, but the most damning evidence came through a covert wiretap placed inside one of Ong's known safe houses there. Investigators captured a conversation between Tan and Ongkum. Calculated and chilling, Tan was heard negotiating terms. She would aid in the cover-up of her husband's murder in exchange for protection and a stake in Ong's operations. It wasn't just complicity, it was collusion. She had been an active participant in the orchestration of To's death, all in a desperate attempt to preserve the illusion of wealth and power. With the final pieces of evidence in place, Wang moved swiftly to bring both Ong and Tan to justice on the day of their arrests. He reflected on just how far the case had come from what initially appeared to be a tragic business dispute to a sprawling conspiracy rooted in deception, organized crime, and calculated betrayal. To Long's murder was no longer about a single act of violence. It was the unraveling of a complex network of illegal operations, financial deceit, and personal manipulation. Ong's arrest marked the collapse of a criminal empire, one that had its roots in high-stakes real estate fraud, loan sharking, and blackmail. The fallout was immense. Businesses shuttered, reputations crumbled, and the collateral damage spread far beyond those directly involved. Daz Wang finalized the case files in the solitude of his office. He felt little satisfaction. Justice had been served, but the scars ran deep. Families had been destroyed, communities shaken, and a man who once stood as a symbol of success had been reduced to a cautionary tale of ambition. Gone Astra for Detective Wang. It was another case closed, but not one easily forgotten. It served as a grim reminder that beneath polished surfaces and social facades, darkness often waits in silence, ready to devour anyone willing to trade integrity for power. Story 4. The murder of Li Xianwei in February 2000. The quiet suburb of Bedtime, Singapore, was shattered by a gruesome murder that sent shockwaves through the local business community. The victim was 32-year-old Li Xianwei, a charismatic and respected entrepreneur who had built a reputation as the forward-thinking founder of X-Tech Innovations, a company specializing in software solutions and digital marketing tools for small businesses. But behind the corporate success and public admiration was a life spinning out of control, a life marked by betrayal, personal conflict, and secrets that would ultimately lead to a violent end. In the morning of February 19th, Xianwei was found dead in his upscale condominium. His body lay sprawled across the living room floor in a pool of blood. A kitchen knife still embedded in his chest. Signs of a brutal struggle surrounded the scene. Furniture overturned, drawers ripped open, and documents scattered across the floor, and yet the rest of the apartment remained oddly untouched, suggesting the killer had been searching for something specific. The body was discovered by Xianwei's personal assistant, Siti Rama, who had worked for him for over 3 years. She arrived at the apartment after repeated failed attempts to contact him. Her voice trembled as she called the police, clearly shaken by the horrific scene. Detective Inspector Tanji Ruomi, a seasoned officer with the Singapore police force, was immediately assigned to the case. Upon arrival, Inspector Tan noted the disarray, but also the precision of the ransacking. The murder weapon, a knife from Shen Wei's own kitchen, suggested that the killer had not brought a weapon, but had instead seized the opportunity during a confrontation. Rama was the first to be interviewed. She recounted her morning, stating she had arrived at the apartment around 10 a.m. after Shen Wei missed 2 high-profile meetings. Something highly unusual for him. The door, she said, had been left unlocked. She stepped in, called his name, and was met with silence until she discovered his body. Her statement was calm but sincere. She seemed genuinely distraught. But Tan knew better than to take anyone at face value in murder cases, especially those involving wealthy or high individuals. Motives often lay hidden beneath a web of loyalty, resentment, and ambition. Tan would need to dig deeper and fast despite her distress. City was clear. She had no knowledge of anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. Employer Detective Inspector Zhang began analyzing the initial findings. Shen Wei had been stabbed multiple times, with a fatal wound piercing his chest. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to have been stolen, suggesting the killer may have been someone Shen Wei knew and willingly let inside. The apartment security footage showed no suspicious visitors in the days leading up to the murder. June now had to consider the unsettling possibility that the killer had been someone within Shen Wei's inner circle. He turned his attention to Shen Wei's business affairs. The victim had built a thriving tech firm, X-Tech Innovations, and had recently secured a lucrative contract with a multinational corporation. Rumors indicated he was preparing to sell the company. News that made him a central figure of interest to numerous stakeholders. One name stood out: Alvin Tan, 45. Shen Wei's business partner of nearly a decade. Alvin had been instrumental in the company's early success, helping to grow XTECH Innovations into a competitive force. But in recent years, tensions had risen between the two men. Shen Wei's ambition to sell the company had caused rifts, with Alvin strongly opposing the idea, fearing not just the loss of control, but the crumbling of the legacy he had helped build. Though Alvin claimed to have been at his office late that evening, working on a new project, John couldn't ignore his potential involvement if Shen Wei's exit threatened Alvin's financial security and professional standing. He had a compelling motive to act. John also delved into Shen Wei's personal life. The tech entrepreneur had been romantically involved with Michelle Lim, a 28-year-old marketing executive from a rival tech company. The two met at a networking event several months before the murder and quickly grew close. However, friends of Shen Wei noted that Michelle had become increasingly distant in the weeks leading up to his death. She often canceled plans and failed to respond to his calls. Michelle was brought in for questioning, though she appeared composed. Her anxious fidgeting betrayed her nerves. She admitted that their relationship had recently ended, citing Shen Wei's growing obsession with work and the impending sale of the company. She claimed she had not been in contact with him in the days before his death, and denied any knowledge of who might have wanted to harm him. John sensed she was holding something back. A deeper dive into Michelle's background revealed troubling financial issues. She had taken out several high-interest loans and was struggling to repay them. Was it possible she had become entangled in a scheme either to gain financially from Shen Wei's death, or simply to rid herself of an increasingly distant partner? With two central suspects, Alvin Tan, with his business-related grievances, and Michelle Lim, with her emotional and financial strain, Zhang was left with frustrating ambiguity. Both had motives, both had alibis, and yet no physical evidence linked them directly to the crime. Determined to break the case, John refocused his team's efforts on two fronts: scrutinizing financial records tied to XTECH Innovations and continuing forensic analysis of Shen Wei's apartment. It was clear the killer had been looking for something specific, perhaps a document or data, rather than valuables. As forensic teams meticulously combed through the crime scene, John's instincts told him that no one close to Shen Wei was entirely innocent. His death was beginning to look less like a tragic act of passion and more like the first domino in a deeper, darker scheme. Pressure mounted as the murder of such a high-profile figure threatened to cast a shadow over Singapore's booming tech industry. The media buzzed with speculation, and John knew that any misstep could undermine public trust not only in law enforcement, but in the city's reputation for safety and order, though Alvin Tan's alibi placed him in his office at the time of the murder. John wasn't convinced. A man who had so much to lose might have found a way to manipulate events from a distance. But suspicion was not enough. Concrete evidence was required. Digging deeper into the company's financial records, the team found that Alvin had indeed been under immense pressure. Though the business was technically profitable, Alvin had been funneling much of the revenue into risky, unproven ventures. These investments were beginning to fail, and his desperation to keep them afloat had pushed him further into debt with each passing day. The case expanded in complexity. John had a gut feeling that the key to solving it lay buried within the company's accounts, and perhaps within the web of deceit spun by those closest to the victim. Shinwei's murder had sparked more than just a police investigation. It had unearthed a sprawling story of ambition, betrayal, and desperation, and John was determined to follow every thread to its bitter end. Further investigation into Shinwei's finances revealed a crucial secret. He had been covertly working on a plan to sell his company to a foreign investor, a move his longtime business partner, Alvin Tan, had strongly opposed. Emails uncovered by Inspector John confirmed that Shin had been meeting with potential buyers without Alvin's knowledge. If the deal had gone through, Alvin's stake in the company could have been significantly possibly erased, depending on the terms. The discovery intensified suspicions. Alvin had every reason to fear being cut out, and everything to lose if the sale went forward without him. No hard evidence tied Alvin directly to the murder. His alibi working late at his office was supported by coworkers and building security. Footage began to hit a wall with Alvin unless something new emerged. Suspicion alone wouldn't be enough. Then came a breakthrough. The forensic team released their analysis of the crime scene. The blood spatter patterns and the position of the body indicated a struggle had taken place, but more intriguingly, a strange residue was discovered on Shinwei's hands, a kind of lubricant or oil, though initially inconclusive. This clue suggested that Shin had been engaged in a physical interaction just before his death. Whether it had been part of a fight or an effort to erase other evidence was still unclear. This unexpected detail steered the investigation in a new direction, and toward Michelle Lim, Shinwei's girlfriend, had initially provided what seemed like a solid alibi, but the forensic results raised new questions. Phone records showed that Michelle and Shin had spoken multiple times on the day of the murder, something she had failed to mention in her first interview. Why had she hidden that? What exactly had they discussed? Michelle wasn't just a romantic figure in Shin's life. She had become entwined in his business decisions with her own mounting financial troubles, including a string of high-interest loans and hidden debts. Investigators wondered whether Michelle had been pressuring Shin for money if he had uncovered her secrets. It could have led to a confrontation, one that turned violent. The lubricant found on Shin's hands could have come from Michelle's vehicle she drove, a temperamental sports car known for frequent engine issues. Had the couple argued in her car shortly before the murder? Had it escalated? With new suspicions, June ordered a deeper dive into Michelle's financial records. It turned out she had been hiding more than a few loans during her second round of questioning. Michelle appeared visibly shaken. Her responses were vague, and she struggled to recall the content of her last conversations with Shin. The more she faltered, the more Joan sensed she was hiding something, digging into her past. Joan uncovered an additional lead. Michelle had been married before her ex-husband had once worked at a company involved in a major financial scandal. Though the connection was tenuous, it hinted at a pattern of involvement with financial instability. Michelle was not just a woman in debt. She was someone who had navigated through a network of financial deceit. Then came the discovery that shifted the case dramatically. While reviewing Shinwei's email communications, John found an exchange between him and a private investigator. Shin had suspected Michelle of hiding something before his death. He had hired someone to look into her background, likely after discovering her financial problems. Was that confrontation the final spark? had Shin threatened to expose her. With this new lead, June was nearly certain Michelle was involved in some way, but a nagging question remained. Was she the killer or just a pawn? The case had taken a darker turn. The pieces were beginning to align, but nothing yet confirmed a single perpetrator. The motive could have stemmed from Michelle's desperation, but it was equally possible she was manipulated into a broader plot orchestrated by someone else. Detective Inspector Temp Shong felt the weight of the case pressing heavily on him. The murder of Shin Wei, an influential figure in Singapore's tech world, had far-reaching implications, not just for the people involved, but for the public's faith in the city's business elite. Every clue uncovered seemed to deepen the mystery. Michelle's unraveling alibi and financial past were troubling, but inconclusive. Could someone else have used her vulnerabilities to cover their own tracks? Had Alvin Tan pulled strings behind the scenes? Was this a murder of passion, or a coldly calculated act driven by greed? In the midst of these swirling doubts, Guillaume continued to sift through the tangled relationships, financial betrayals, and hidden motives. The breakthrough had come, but the puzzle was still far from complete. As Inspector Tan Zirong delved deeper into Xian Wei's business dealings, he stumbled upon a revelation that would drastically alter the course of the proposed sale of X-Tech Innovations had seemed like a simple motive for Alvin Tana, man who stood to lose everything if the deal went through without his approval. But buried in a trove of emails, Jerome discovered a name that hadn't surfaced in any previous interviews. Marcus. Marcus was an outsider. He had no known ties to X-Tech or the local business community, but a closer look revealed that Marcus had a history of involvement in questionable tech investments, particularly with struggling startups. His connection to Xian Wei was obscure, but the emails between them suggested something more sinister. The correspondence showed that Marcus and Xian had been negotiating a high-stakes deal, one not just about the company, but about X-Tech's most valuable asset, its proprietary software. Marcus wasn't interested in profits or leadership. He wanted access to the intellectual property, code worth millions on the black market. Yet appeared that Marcus had been pressuring Xian for months, but when Xian began backing out of the arrangement, the tone of Marcus's messages changed. The deal had gone. Suan Jiran's instincts told him this wasn't just a failed business transaction. Marcus Yeo had a violent past. He had been previously linked to a series of unsolved robberies and assaults tied to the underground tech trade. His name had surfaced in other investigations, though nothing had ever stuck. Now, Shirong was convinced Marcus's involvement with Xian was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. With a renewed sense of urgency, Shirong and his team traced Marcus's movements. A tip led them to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, an area known for illicit activity. When they arrived, the site appeared abandoned, but inside, they found a trove of high-end tech equipments, stolen laptops, software disks, and hacking tools. Then, they found something chilling. A bloodied shirt tucked beneath a pile of debris. Jirong immediately recognized it matched a shirt Xian had been seen wearing in a photo taken just days before his murder. Forensic analysis confirmed it. The blood belonged to Xian Wei. That single piece of evidence changed everything. It placed Xian at the warehouse before his death and shifted the presumed murder location from his apartment to this grim, makeshift tech lair. Jerome now believed Xian had gone to the warehouse to confront Marcus lightly, in an attempt to finalize or reject their secret deal. Instead, the encounter had turned deadly. Marcus had ambushed him, enraged over being denied access to the software. The confrontation escalated into a fatal attack. In a panic, Marcus had fled the scene, taking a kitchen knife from the warehouse with him, the very weapon believed to have been used in the murder. Xirong launched a citywide manhunt after days of surveillance. Marcus was found hiding in a remote apartment, attempting to sell stolen tech equipment online. The arrest was swift at first. Marcus refused to speak, but when presented with the blood evidence and the shirt, his composure cracked. He admitted to luring Xian to the warehouse under the guise of settling their dispute. He claimed he never meant to kill him, that it had been a moment of rage. Not premeditation, but the damage had already been done. His actions, driven by greed and desperation, had ended in cold-blooded murderous. The case against Marcus Yeo moved forward. Inspector Jerome couldn't help but reflect on the trail of betrayal, ambition, and violence that had led to Exion Wei's death. What began as a secretive business negotiation had unraveled into a brutal confrontation. Driven by the dark underbelly of the tech world, Exion had paid the ultimate price for trying to protect his creation. Marcus' arrest brought some measure of closure, but for those closest to Exion and for the business community that once looked up to him, the scars remained. His murder had exposed a disturbing truth about the hidden dangers within the tech industry and the lengths to which some would go to claim power. The trial began months later. Drawing massive public attention, the courtroom was packed with journalists, tech entrepreneurs, and grieving family members. Every revelation peeled back another layer of this tragic story. Marcus Yeo stood accused of first-degree murder and unlawful possession of stolen intellectual property, but for everyone who had followed the case from the beginning, the charges represented more than legal accountability. They were a reckoning for the choices that had led a brilliant mind like Exion Wei to an early grave. Marcus Yeo, now facing charges of murder and possession of stolen property, was represented by a high-powered defense attorney who claimed the killing was the result of a heated argument gone tragically wrong. But the prosecution offered a starkly different version of events in court. The evidence laid out was damning. A trove of incriminating emails, the discovery of the bloodied shirt, the stolen proprietary software, and the detailed testimony of forensic experts who confirmed the true murder site, an abandoned warehouse far from the victim's home. The defense's version of a crime of passion simply couldn't hold up against the strength of this evidence. The trial unfolded. Inspector Girong sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, witnessing the final chapter of a case he had painstakingly unraveled over several months. It was a bittersweet moment. Justice for Exion Wei had come, but the cost had been immeasurable. Exion's family, once filled with pride over his success, was now left to mourn a man taken far too soon. His once promising company, X-Tech Innovations, was now tainted by scandal, its future uncertain, and its reputation fractured. Desperate to shift the narrative, the defense tried a new tactic. They suggested that Marcus Yeo wasn't acting alone. They hinted at a wider conspiracy and even went as far as implying that Alvin Tan, Exion's business partner, might have been involved in orchestrating the murder, but without any credible evidence and with Alvin's airtight alibi, these insinuations fell flat. The defense's final hope rested on Marcus himself, who eventually took the stand. Gone was the defiant, tight-lipped man first arrested. In his place stood someone visibly shaken, remorseful, and tired. His voice trembled as he recounted the events of that night. He admitted his actions were reckless. Born out of frustration and desperation, he claimed he had only intended to confront Exion to demand access to the software he believed he was owed. But when Exion refused, Marcus said, something inside him snapped. "I never meant to kill him," Marcus told the court, voice cracking. "I just wanted what was mine, but when it went too far, I panicked. I didn't know what to do." Despite his emotional testimony, the jury was unmoved. The evidence spoke louder than his words. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, Marcus Yeo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reactions to the verdict were mixed. Some within the business community expressed faint sympathy for Marcus, viewing him as a man broken by greed and the pressure to succeed. But for Exion Wei's family, the verdict was a long-awaited moment of justice, one that validated their grief and confirmed that the man responsible for destroying their world would never walk free again. As Marcus was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Inspector Jerome allowed himself a quiet breath of closure. The case was over, but the questions it raised lingered. What truly drove Marcus to such violent extremes? Had the relentless pursuit of wealth and control really blinded him to the consequences of his actions? And more disturbingly, how many others in the business world might be harboring similar darkness beneath polished facades? The murder of Exion Wei had exposed the corrosive effects of ambition. Unchecked, what began as a secret deal turned into betrayal, bloodshed, and the fall of a visionary. His dream for X-Tech Innovations, a company built on progress and collaboration, was left in ruins. But in the months following the trial, the company found new life. X-Tech was sold to an outside investor, one who pledged to uphold Exion's original vision while cleansing the toxic culture that had brewed. Behind closed doors, Alvin Tan, despite the rumors and initial suspicion, stepped into a new role within the company, yet he remained haunted by the tragedy that had irreversibly bound his future to the loss of his partner. As for Inspector Gurung, the case remained etched in his memory, a brutal reminder of the human cost behind power struggles and the fragile line between innovation and obsession. He had solved the mystery, but beneath the surface, he knew there were countless others, just like it, waiting in the shadows. Story 5. In the cold, gray hours of the morning on February 15, 2000, the quiet town of Fairfax, Virginia was rocked by a crime that would haunt the community for years to come. The body of 45-year-old Nancy Gorman was discovered inside her modest home. She had been brutally murdered. Nancy was a respected high school history teacher, known for her dedication to students and her solitary, peaceful life. She lived alone on the outskirts of town, far from the busier suburban neighborhoods. Her world was quiet, predictable, but that morning, it was torn apart by violence. No one could have anticipated. Nancy's younger sister, Ellen, found her concerned after repeated unanswered calls. Ellen stopped by the house, something she rarely had to do, given how close the sisters were. The moment she arrived, something felt wrong. The front door was slightly ajar. Inside, Ellen was met with a horror no family should ever endure. Nancy lying face down in the living room, blood pooling around her. The scene was chaotic: furniture overturned, personal items strewn across the floor. There had clearly been a struggle, but one detail disturbed officers the most. There was no sign of forced entry. The initial autopsy suggested that Nancy had been bludgeoned with a heavy object, likely a blunt instrument, never recovered. The injuries to her head were extensive, indicating repeated, frenzied blows. Yet, despite the brutality of the scene, nothing of value had been taken. Her wallet and purse remained untouched. Her car was still parked neatly in the driveway. This wasn't a robbery, it was personal detective Jack Reynolds of the Fairfax County Police Department was assigned the case. A veteran investigator, Reynolds had seen his fair share of homicides, but something about this one felt different. Nancy's life was so ordinary, her circle so small, that the sheer violence of the crime felt almost incompatible with who she was. He surveyed the scene meticulously, noting the small details others might overlook. The direction of the blood splatter, the struggle marks near the doorway, the subtle smear on the doorframe. He instructed his team to canvass the neighborhood, to speak with anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual in the days prior. Most neighbors claimed to have noticed nothing, but one man, a middle-aged neighbor named Thomas, recalled something odd. A car parked outside Nancy's house the night before the murder. It wasn't familiar, and he didn't get a good look, but it was the first potential lead Reynolds had pursued, it digging into Nancy's life. Reynolds found little in the way of controversy. She was quiet, private, loved by her students, and respected by her peers. Her colleagues at Fairfax High described her as dedicated, if a bit reserved. She didn't date much, she didn't socialize often, but someone, somewhere, had wanted her dead end. Reynolds was determined to find out who Nancy had no known enemies, at least none that stood out. Her family, friends, and even her students were baffled. No one could think of a single person who might want to harm her. That only deepened the mystery surrounding her death. An autopsy confirmed what detectives had initially suspected. Nancy had been struck multiple times in the head with extreme force, resulting in severe trauma. The coroner also documented defensive wounds on her arms and hands, clear signs that she had fought back. Yet there was no evidence of sexual assault, and nothing had been stolen. This wasn't a random act of violence or a botched robbery, was deeply personal. Detective Reynolds shifted focus to Nancy's personal life. He requested her phone records, hoping they might reveal something overlooked. What he found was shocking. For several months leading up to her murder, Nancy had been receiving disturbing phone calls. The caller never spoke, just silence or abrupt hang-ups. At first, she hadn't taken them seriously, assuming it was a prank or a telemarketer. But the frequency of the calls increased, and she grew more unsettled still. She told no one. Her friends and family had no idea. The calls had been made from various payphones around the area, making it hard to track. But one number stood out. It had appeared repeatedly in the 2 weeks before Nancy's death. The number was traced to Kevin Matthews, a former student of Nancy's who had graduated from Fairfax High several years earlier. Revelation rocked the investigation. Kevin had been a bright but troubled teen, known for clashing with authority figures. He'd dropped out of college and returned to Fairfax, bouncing between low-paying jobs. Though his interactions with Nancy were mostly in the past, there were reports of friction during his time in her class. Kevin had often challenged her during lessons, especially when it came to how she taught history. Nothing had escalated at the time, but it was enough to raise serious concerns. No ordered a search of Kevin's apartment. Kevin was home when officers arrived. He was visibly anxious, defensive, and insisted he had nothing to do with Nancy's death. But his behavior raised suspicions inside his apartment. Investigators found several notebooks filled with angry rants and disturbing writings, many of them fixated on Nancy. He accused her of ruining his life, claiming she had treated him unfairly in school. As they read on, the tone of the entries became darker, more erratic. When questioned, Kevin admitted to making the harassing phone calls. He said they were an attempt to get Nancy's attention, to make her confront the way she had treated him. Years ago, he was convinced she still held a grudge, though there was no evidence she had ever targeted him. Kevin revealed that he had bumped into Nancy several months prior in town. During that brief encounter, she had been dismissive, even cold, at least in his eyes. To him, it felt like rejection all over again. That moment reignited his obsession, turning his lingering resentment into something far more dangerous. Despite the emotional volatility, Kevin denied killing Nancy. He claimed he had never been to her house that night. So far, his alibi checked out. No forensic evidence tied him to the scene, but the growing pile of circumstantial evidence painted a disturbing picture of a man unraveling his notebooks. His obsessive behavior and his past with Nancy suggested he was capable of more than just idle threats. Detective Reynolds had reached a critical juncture. Was Kevin Matthews capable of murder? And if so, what had pushed him over the edge? Reynolds had seen obsession before, but this felt different. Kevin showed no remorse. He spoke calmly, passively, but with a strange tension simmering beneath the surface. As Reynolds dug deeper, a clearer picture emerged. Kevin had always been an outsider in Fairfax, bullied, withdrawn, never quite fitting in. His academic record was average, and his relationships with teachers, especially Nancy, were strained. She had pushed him, challenged him, expected more. Kevin saw it as a personal attack to him. She had symbolized every failure, every door that had closed in his face. He had convinced himself that she had always thought he would amount to nothing. His resentment festered for years. After dropping out of college, Kevin drifted odd jobs, dead ends, the weight of unmet expectations. He began revisiting old haunts, particularly the high school, where Nancy still taught. At first, the visits were casual, then frequent, then obsessive. To pass by, hoping to glimpse her. Every encounter only added fuel to the fire. In the months before Nancy's death, Kevin's obsession had reached its peak. He spent hours outside her home, watching, waiting, lost in a fantasy where she would finally acknowledge him or pay for what he believed she had done. For hours, Kevin Matthews would sit outside Nancy Gorman's home, silently watching through the windows, trying to piece together a life he felt had left him behind from a distance. He studied her routines, her world, and perhaps the peace she seemed to have found. To Kevin, Nancy wasn't just a former teacher. She symbolized everything he had failed to become: respected, successful, and quietly influential within the community. He believed she had never truly recognized his potential, and that imagined slight became the seed of his growing fixation. What began as a few anonymous calls late at night soon spiraled into a daily ritual of harassment. Kevin had convinced himself that if Nancy would just acknowledge him, if she would validate his pain and apologize for her mistreatment, he could finally find peace. But as the calls grew more frequent and aggressive, it became clear that Kevin wasn't looking for closure. He was demanding power. He wanted control over a narrative that had haunted him since high school. Detective Jack Reynolds, still seeking a definitive link between Kevin and the murder, had his team re-examine the phone records. What they found was damning. Kevin had made several calls to Nancy's house between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock p.m. on the night of February 14, 2000, just hours before her sister discovered her body. The next morning, Nancy would have been home, likely alone. During that window, the timing was chilling, but Reynolds needed more. He sent officers to canvass the neighborhood again, hoping someone might have noticed something they hadn't shared earlier. That's when Margaret, a neighbor across the street, came forward with a revelation. Margaret recalled hearing a heated argument coming from Nancy's house that night, then loud, urgent knocking. She hadn't seen anyone through her window, but the sounds were clear in retrospect. Margaret believed she had heard the final moments of a confrontation that had spiraled out of control. The picture was beginning to form. Kevin had likely gone to Nancy's house, expecting a reckoning, some final confrontation where she would finally acknowledge his suffering. But when Nancy refused to engage, possibly alarmed by his erratic behavior, the situation escalated. Kevin's rage boiled over. He struck her repeatedly, in a fit of fury and entitlement. The struggle ended with Nancy on the floor, bludgeoned beyond recognition. In the chaos, Kevin fled, leaving behind a silent house and the aftermath of his wrath. What struck Reynolds the most was Kevin's demeanor. There was no guilt, no regret. When asked about the incident, Kevin simply shrugged, as if describing a disagreement rather than a brutal murder. His affect was flat, emotionless, almost eerily disconnected from the gravity of what he had done. It confirmed Reynolds' worst fears. Kevin wasn't just obsessed, he was emotionally vacant. Detached from the violence he had unleashed, Reynolds ordered a more forceful interrogation. Detectives laid out everything: the phone records, the witness account, the disturbing journals filled with rage and fixation. For a long time, Kevin said nothing. Then, quietly, he broke it. Was supposed to be just a conversation. He mumbled, "I just wanted her to hear me, to understand, but then it all went wrong. I didn't mean to kill her, but it was too late." The truth was now clear. Kevin Matthews had murdered Nancy Gorman in a fit of obsessive fury. A woman who had once tried to guide him had become the unwilling target of years of pent-up resentment, and it had ended in unimaginable tragedies. The confession was processed. Reynolds began preparing for the upcoming trial, but one question echoed in his mind: how many others like Kevin were out there? People carrying quiet grudges, simmering under the surface, invisible until it was too late. This wasn't just a story of one man's obsession, it was a grim lesson about the unchecked power of resentment. Kevin had slipped through the cracks, his descent unnoticed, his emotions unaddressed. His madness had been subtle, hidden in plain sight. Nancy Gorman had no idea. She had never treated Kevin cruelly. She had been firm, yes, but fair. She had tried to push him toward betterment, not failure. And yet, to Kevin, she became the face of his inadequacy. As Reynolds reflected on the case, more questions surfaced. Why had Kevin's obsession grown to this point? Was this simply unprocessed anger, or had deeper mental illness been at play? Was there something that could have been done to stop it? Nancy Gorman's death was a tragedy, not just because of the violence, but because it may have been preventable. Her life ended at the hands of someone she had once tried to help, and in her murder, Fairfax was left with a reminder that the human psyche, when left unchecked, can turn even a quiet suburban street into the setting for horror investigation. Wasn't just about justice, it was about warning. Reynolds knew that this case would haunt him for years, because in every silent face in a crowd, in every loner slipping through society's cracks, there might be another Kevin Matthews, and next time, it might not be Nancy. The night of February 14th still held secrets despite Kevin Matthews' confession. Detective Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. As the days passed, he and his team pored over every detail again, searching for a final, undeniable truth. Then came a breakthrough. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed a troubling detail. The blood spatter patterns indicated Nancy had been attacked in the living room, but faint traces of blood led to the back door, along with a smeared impression in the carpet. Subtle but unmistakable, it looked like someone had tried to flee. Nancy, perhaps, had made a desperate attempt to escape before succumbing to her injuries. This changed everything. Reynolds paused. Was Kevin really alone that night? Or had someone else been there, another presence lurking in the shadows? Kevin's confession, given under intense pressure, suddenly seemed incomplete. His words, "I didn't mean to kill her," might have been more than just damage control. What if he had been provoked, manipulated, or even aided? Reynolds began to look deeper, not just at Kevin's connection to Nancy, but at the people who had been part of his life in the years leading up to her murder. He retraced Kevin's history, speaking to former friends, partners, and classmates. Interviews stood out. Kevin's former girlfriend from his late teens described him as possessive and increasingly erratic. She recalled how often he brought up Nancy, fixated on how she had belittled him, ignored him, underestimated him. At the time, she dismissed it as bitterness over high school years gone wrong, but now, it felt like a red flag. She also remembered something chilling. Kevin had once said he planned to confront Nancy, make her understand what it felt like to be powerless at the time. She had written it off as empty talk, but now, it felt like a prophecy of the violence that would follow. Reynolds' investigation took a darker turn. If Kevin wasn't acting alone, if someone had encouraged or even orchestrated his actions, who were they? A name surfaced. Daniel, a former friend of Kevin's. Daniel had known him since high school, but had drifted apart over the years. Still, they had the occasional conversation. Daniel described Kevin's behavior in recent years as increasingly secretive. He'd begun associating with a new group, older men who lived on society's margins. They spoke with venom about getting back at the people who had wronged them. Daniel recalled overhearing a disturbing conversation where one of them urged Kevin to act. Now Reynolds had something concrete. Kevin may have been a willing participant, but he may also have been pushed. A full investigation into this group was ordered. Background checks, surveillance interviews. Reynolds needed to know, was this a circle of influence, a toxic echo chamber that had fed Kevin's resentment until it became lethal? With each day, the case grew more layered, more unsettling. This was no longer just about a man obsessed with a former teacher. This was about the dangerous fusion of isolation, vulnerability, and manipulation. Kevin had been emotionally also malleable, eager for approval, susceptible to influence. Somewhere along the way, he had slipped through the cracks. Nancy Gorman's murder, Reynolds realized, was more than an act of violence born from fixation. It was a consequence of years of emotional neglect, missed warning signs, and the toxic power of unresolved trauma. The further Reynolds went, the more questions he uncovered. How many other people, like Kevin, were walking around with quiet rage building inside them, waiting for someone to feed it? How many were hiding in plain sight? And how many more Nancys would it take before society started paying attention? In the end, Nancy's death would not just be remembered as a tragedy, but as a reflection of something much deeper, a case that exposed the fragility of the human mind, the dangers of emotional manipulation, and the systems that too often fail to intervene in time. Kevin Matthews could have been exploited by the wrong people and Detective Reynolds was beginning to suspect that's exactly what had happened. These individuals, Reynolds believed, hadn't just noticed Kevin's emotional vulnerability, they had used it. They saw in him someone fragile, malleable, opportunity to manipulate someone teetering on the edge for their own ends. With this new understanding, Reynolds and his team worked tirelessly to trace and interview those connected to Kevin in the months leading up to Nancy's death. Their focus soon narrowed to one man. Lucas. Lucas wasn't just a name on a list, he had a criminal history that stretched back years. Petty thefts, assaults, and ties to groups that showed open disdain for the law. More troubling, Lucas had been seen with Kevin multiple times in the weeks before the murderers. Investigators dug deeper. A chilling pattern began to emerge. Lucas wasn't just a criminal, he was a manipulator. He had a knack for preying on those weaker than him, and it quickly became clear he'd taken advantage of Kevin's loneliness and obsession with Nancy. Some witnesses even suggested Lucas had encouraged Kevin's fixation, feeding his delusions, perhaps even daring him to act on them. The further Reynolds looked, the more it seemed Kevin's descent hadn't happened in isolation. It had been accelerated, pushed along by toxic relationships that nurtured his rage. What began as a murder investigation had evolved into something much larger, a sobering case study in how unchecked mental illness, social isolation, and the wrong company can combine into something deadly. Kevin Matthews had been a ticking time bomb. Nancy Gorman's death was the tragic detonation. Her murder left the Fairfax community devastated. Nancy wasn't just a victim, she had been a beloved teacher, a mentor, a woman who dedicated her life to helping others succeed. To those who had worked with her, it was almost unthinkable that someone so kind and intelligent could die in such a brutal, senseless way. Kevin was eventually charged with second-degree murder. His confession had given prosecutors what they needed, but for Reynolds, the case was far from over. He believed that the influence of Lucas and others in Kevin's circle would only strengthen the state's case. Still, justice felt incomplete. Nancy was gone, and no sentence could undo the damage. Not to her family, not to her students, and not to the town that had trusted it could protect people like her. The trial that followed was long and agonizing. Kevin pled guilty, but his mental health was placed under the microscope. His defense team argued that Kevin's psychological condition had diminished his ability to understand the consequences of his actions. They painted him as unstable, manipulated, and broken. But the prosecution told a different story. They described a man whose obsession had spiraled out of control, someone who allowed himself to be fueled by resentment and surrounded himself with people who encouraged his worst impulses. Kevin's mental illness, they argued, didn't excuse his choices, it explained them. In the end, the court agreed. Kevin Matthews was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole yet. For all the courtroom's finality, the case left behind wounds that couldn't be closed by a verdict. Detective Reynolds, despite seeing justice served, couldn't escape a heavy truth. This was more than a story about one man's crime. It was a story about the conditions that allowed it to happen. The system had failed Kevin, yes, but it had failed Nancy even more. Her death was the result of missed warning signs, ignored pleas, and societal negligence toward emotional instability and toxic influence. Kevin may have pulled the trigger, but the forces that pushed him to that point had been building for years, unseen, unchecked, and ultimately fatal. Fairfax slowly began to heal. Nancy Gorman's memory remained her life, and the tragedy of its end became a reminder of why compassion, vigilance, and early intervention matters so deeply, because sometimes the people most in danger are the ones suffering in silence. Sestio Y6. The murder of Julie ADMC, February 2000. The small town of Bellevue, Ohio, was rocked by a tragedy that would haunt its residents for years. It began when the body of a young woman was found in a wooded area just outside town. The discovery shocked the quiet, tight-knit community, not just because of the violence, but because of who the victim was. Her name was Julie Adams, a 29-year-old school teacher. Julie was known for her warmth, her dedication to her students, and her quiet strength, but few people knew the deeper story, the one involving her ex-boyfriend. Carl Benton. Their relationship had been stormy, and their breakup even worse. Julie had tried to move on, even finding new love with a man named David Keller, whom she had met just months before her death, but Carl had never truly let go. The night she vanished, Julie had stayed late at school for a faculty meeting. She had plans to meet David for dinner afterward, but she never showed. Her family reported her missing the next morning. Julie's car was still in the school parking lot, but there was no sign of her, no forced entry, no clear struggle for a time. The trail was cold. Then came an anonymous tip. Someone had seen a man matching Carl Benton's description near the site where Julie's body was ultimately discovered. Police brought Carl in for questioning, and while he denied any involvement, his calm demeanor felt off. Carl claimed he had spent the night at home, alone, watching TV, but when detectives checked local surveillance footage and questioned neighbors, his story began to crumble. Cameras at a nearby gas station showed Carl's truck driving in the direction of the crime scene just hours before Julie's body was found. As investigators looked closer, a disturbing pattern of behavior had shown up uninvited at Julie's home on multiple occasions. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting. He had even threatened David, Julie's new partner. In a jealous rage, he was obsessed, and he didn't want to let her go to Carl. Julie wasn't her own person, she was his, and if he couldn't have her, no one else would. As the investigation progressed, police became convinced that Carl's inability to move on and his escalating behavior had culminated in murder. Investigators conducted a meticulous search of Carl Benton's home and uncovered several deeply disturbing items. Among his personal belongings was a stack of unsent letters, all addressed to Julie. The contents were unsettling, desperate pleas for reconciliation, promises to change, and chilling threats of what he might do if she refused to return to him. The letters painted a haunting picture of a man spiraling into obsession, unable to accept the end of their relationship. But it wasn't just the letters that raised red flags. Hidden inside Carl's bedroom closet, police discovered a large kitchen knife. Forensic analysis later confirmed the worst. The blood on the blade belonged to Julie. With this physical evidence, Carl Benton's connection to Julie's murder became undeniable. Still, one crucial question remained: what had driven him to kill her? The motive became clearer when police interviewed Julie's new boyfriend, David Keller. David revealed that, just days before her death, Julie had received a threatening phone call from Carl. During the call, Carl had ominously told her, "If I can't have you, no one else will." Julie had been terrified. David urged her to report it to the police, but she hesitated, fearful of provoking Carl further. She changed her phone number and tried to distance herself, but Carl had found a way to track her down. David's account aligned with the tone of the letters police had recovered. Carl had written of his refusal to accept Julie's new relationship and asserted that if she wasn't with him, she shouldn't be with anyone. It was clear that Carl saw her not as a person with autonomy, but as something he believed he owned. Detective Sarah Mitchell, the lead investigator on the case, carefully reviewed all the evidence. The circumstantial case against Carl was substantial. He had motive, means, and opportunity. He had been the last person to see Julie alive, and the knife stained with her blood linked him directly to the crime. Yet Mitchell knew this wasn't simply a case of a jealous ex-boyfriend turned killer. She wanted to understand what had truly driven Carl to murder. As she delved into Carl's background, the picture became more complex. Carl had grown up in a deeply dysfunctional home, an abusive, alcoholic father, and an emotionally absent mother. His childhood was marked by violence, instability, and emotional neglect. These early experiences left lasting scars, shaping Carl into an emotionally stunted adult who struggled to form healthy relationships. Julie had started dating Carl under seemingly normal circumstances, but over time, their relationship took a dark turn. Carl became controlling, manipulative, and emotionally volatile. When Julie eventually ended things, Carl couldn't handle the rejection. Other women who had dated him told similar stories of being stalked, harassed, and manipulated after trying to leave one ex-girlfriend. Heather recounted how Carl would call her repeatedly, appear uninvited at her workplace, and even follow her home eventually. She had to file a restraining order. Mitchell saw a pattern. Carl didn't view romantic partners as equals, he viewed them as possessions. Love, to him, was not about mutual respect, but control. When Julie moved on and began dating someone new, Carl's illusion of ownership was shattered. His obsession deepened. He began stalking her more aggressively, showing up at her home, waiting outside her school, leaving unwanted gifts. Julie tried to distance herself, but Carl's fixation had reached a dangerous crescendo. By February 2000, Carl had reached a breaking point. On the night Julie was killed, Carl drove to her home as he had done many times before, but this time he came armed. Investigators discovered that he had purchased a knife found at the crime scene just days before her death, suggesting premeditation. That night, Julie was home alone, waiting for David Keller to join her for dinner. David later confirmed that Julie had been excited and in good spirits when David arrived. Julie's car was still outside, but the house was dark, the front door locked, and there was no response when he knocked. It wasn't until the following morning, when Julie's body was discovered in a wooded area nearby, that the full horror came to light. The police quickly linked Carl to the murder, but needed more than circumstantial evidence. Detective Mitchell brought Carl in for another round of questioning. This time, he was less composed, though he denied involvement. His body language told a different story, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting, growing defensive when asked about the knife. After hours of questioning, Carl finally cracked tearfully. He confessed to going to Julie's house that night. He claimed he had only wanted to talk to her, to make her see reason, but when she refused, he snapped in a fit of rage. He grabbed the knife from his truck and attacked her. Confession was harrowing. It revealed not only the crime, but the mind of a man consumed by obsession, shaped by a lifetime of emotional damage, and driven by a belief that love meant control. Julie's murder was not an isolated act of violence. It was the tragic endpoint of a long, dangerous descent into possessive madness. For Detective Mitchell, the case was solved, but the emotional scars it left behind for Julie's loved ones and for the community would take far longer to heal. Carl Benton described how Julie had tried to run, how she'd fled into the woods, terrified, trying to escape him, but he had chased her, cornered her, and ultimately killed her. In his statement, Carl claimed he never meant for things to go that far. He said, "It just happened," but his cold detachment, his lack of remorse, and his attempts to justify the horror only made the confession more chilling. Despite Carl's admission, key questions remained. Chief among them, how had Julie's body ended up several miles from her home without anyone noticing? Investigators suspected Carl had used his truck to move her, but they needed concrete proof. A forensic search of the vehicle revealed blood traces in the cargo area. DNA tests confirmed it belonged to Julie. With that, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. The evidence was irrefutable. Carl Benton had taken Julie Adams' life. As the trial approached, Detective Sarah Mitchell meticulously reviewed every detail of the case. One final time, the evidence against Carl was overwhelming, but what haunted her most wasn't just what Carl had done, it was how many signs had been missed, how many red flags had gone unnoticed. Julie hadn't simply fallen victim to a sudden act of rage. She had been stalked, harassed, and hunted by a man whose obsession had spiraled violently out of control. The investigation revealed the terrifying depth of Carl's fixation. His inability to handle rejection, coupled with his deteriorating mental state, had paved the way for a senseless act of brutality. In the end, Julie paid the ultimate price for trying to move on with her life. Carl Benton was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But no sentence could undo the devastation his actions had caused. The quiet community of Bellevue, town unaccustomed to such darkness, was left shattered by Julie's death. She had been a beloved known for her kindness and her dedication. Her only crime had been trying to break free from a man who refused to let go. Julie's murder became a grim symbol of how obsession, when left unchecked, can turn deadly. And as Bellevue grappled with its collective grief, the town struggled to reconcile the Carl Benton they thought they knew with the monster he had become. But the trial was about more than justice. It was about understanding the mind behind the crime. The courtroom was packed when Carl Benton was finally brought to trial. Julie's family, her colleagues, and her closest friends sat silently in the front row, searching for some semblance of closure. The atmosphere was heavy, the weight of unspoken sorrow hanging in the air. Carl's defense attorneys painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man tormented by unresolved trauma, someone emotionally broken by a troubled past. They argued that his actions were not premeditated, but the product of a mind unraveling. They blamed heartbreak, abandonment, and mental illness. They claimed Carl hadn't planned to kill Julie, that he'd acted in a state of emotional overload. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They presented a very different portrait, one of manipulation, control, and months of escalating obsession. They argued that Carl Benton knew exactly what he was doing, that he had been warned repeatedly by Julie and others to stay away, and that he had ignored every boundary she tried to set. His love, they said, wasn't love at all. It was domination disguised as affection. The prosecution's most powerful evidence came in the form of letters. Carl had written to Julie, dozens of them. They were filled with erratic declarations of love, sinister threats, and possessive language. He wrote things like, "You belong to me, and if I can't have you, no one will." He spoke of violence, of consequences, and of how no man could ever take her place. In every word, his obsession bled through Carl. Love was not a bond, it was ownership. The letters were more than just disturbing. They were damning. Carl's defense tried to mitigate the damage by calling in mental health experts. They testified about his traumatic childhood, the years of emotional neglect, and his inability to form healthy attachments. They suggested that Carl didn't understand the boundaries of a normal relationship, that he wasn't evil, just broken. Some even argued that he had suffered a psychotic break, that the murder was an act of temporary insanity. But the prosecution held firm. They argued that Carl hadn't lost control. He had seized at that. He had written his own narrative, where he was entitled to decide who Julie could love. They brought in witnesses, Julie's friends, her co-workers, who spoke about Carl's increasingly erratic behavior, how he had shown up uninvited, called her incessantly, watched her from a distance, how Julie had changed her number, locked her doors, confided that she was afraid she had done everything she could to protect herself. And still, Carl came for her. The most heartbreaking testimony came from Julie's family. Her mother, her sister, and her closest friends all took the stand. They spoke of a woman who had been full of life and light, an educator, a friend, a daughter with dreams, laughter, and love to give. They spoke about the toll the harassment had taken on her, how her spark had dimmed, how she'd grown anxious, how she had lived in fear. They remembered her bravery, her compassion, her refusal to hate, even when she was being hunted. But in the end, their love could not shield her from the darkness that followed her. Julie Adams was a vibrant, compassionate soul who had touched countless lives. She did everything she could to escape the grip of a man who refused to see her as human. In doing so, she became a chilling reminder of how quickly obsession can turn lethal. Carl Benton's trial ended in a conviction, but for those left behind, the wound remains open. Despite the defense's efforts, they couldn't sway the jury from the truth. Carl Benton had become consumed by obsession, and that obsession had spiraled into deadly violence. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts. Carl was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge offered no leniency. There was none to be found in a case so clear-cut, so tragic for Julie's loved ones. The verdict offered a measure of justice, but not healing. Nothing could bring back the vibrant young woman they had lost. Julie's life had been full of promise, her death a stark warning about the dangers of obsessive relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked fixation. Carl Benton had destroyed her life and his own because he couldn't let go in the years following the trial. Julie's family and friends turned their grief into action. They created a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting victims of stalking and relationship violence through public speaking, awareness campaigns, and educational programs. They made Julie's story a platform for change. Her legacy became a force for good, shining light into the dark corners, where emotional abuse, manipulation, and control, often high Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had led the investigation, found that the case had left a permanent mark on her she had seen up close. How obsession could warp love into something sinister. Though the case was officially closed, the lessons it offered remained with her. Shaping her approach to future investigations, she became a vocal advocate for domestic violence awareness, working alongside local organizations to educate the public about the signs of controlling and emotionally abusive relationships. Carl Benton's life behind bars was one of isolation and consequence. He tried to rationalize his actions in letters to family and friends, claiming he had acted out of love and that Julie's death was a misunderstanding, but the other inmates didn't buy it. Carl's twisted sense of affection earned him no sympathy. The man who had once been seen as a neighbor and a teacher became a symbol of obsession gone deadly over time. Carl's case became a cautionary tale in criminal psychology courses, a textbook example of how affection can mutate into control, and how a deluded mind can justify destruction in the name of love. Experts dissected his behavior, warning others of the subtle but dangerous progression from emotional dependency to violent obsession back in Bellevue. The impact of Julie's death lingered long after the courtroom. Doors had closed her school, created a scholarship in her memory, awarded to students who showed promise in teaching and compassion. Two of the values she had lived by it was a bittersweet honor, a reminder of the light she had brought into the world and the darkness that had extinguished it. Julie Adams's name became synonymous with both tragedy and resilience. While Carl Benton had taken her life, he could not steal her legacy. Her story inspired others to speak up, to seek help, and to recognize the early warning signs of dangerous relationships. Through her memory, lives continued to be saved. The case changed Bellevue forever. The town, once peaceful, had been rocked by a horror few could have anticipated. But out of that horror came a deeper understanding of emotional abuse and a renewed commitment to protecting others from similar fates. Julie's death had been senseless, but her and retell Doford, meaning awareness and hope. Story 7. The Glendale Motel murdering, March of 2000. A chilling case would shake the quiet town of Glendale, Arizona, to its core. It began with the discovery of a man's body inside a dilapidated motel room on the outskirts of the city. The victim was identified as 42-year-old Michael Harrington, a businessman with no known enemies. But as investigators soon learned, the circumstances surrounding his death revealed a far darker truth. Michael had lived in Glendale for several years, having relocated from Seattle after a difficult divorce. He was a father of two, a quiet man who worked as a sales executive at a modest tech firm. To most, he seemed unremarkable, cordial but reserved, burdened by a sense of loneliness since his marriage had ended. Friends described him as someone trying to rebuild, someone searching for purpose in the routine of work and the temporary escape offered by evening visits to local bars. The night of March 5, 2000, Michael checked into the Desert Breeze Motel, a low-cost establishment known for its transient guests. The motel's manager recalled that Michael had arrived around 9:00 p.m., appearing tense and in a hurry. He brought no luggage and seemed distracted, almost as if he were expecting someone. The manager thought little of it at the time. People came and went all the time. The next morning, March 6th, a housekeeper knocked on the door of room 12. When no one answered, she used her master key to enter. What she found inside was horrifying. Michael Harrington's body lay on the floor, His throat slashed with precision. There was remarkably little blood, suggesting the killer may have restrained him, or killed him in a way that prevented significant splatter. The room had been ransacked, but oddly, there were no signs of forced entry. Even more puzzling, none of Michael's valuables were missing. His wallet, watch, and phone were all still there. The Glendale Police Department quickly launched a homicide investigation. Veteran detective Laura Mitchell was assigned the case as she surveyed the crime scene. Several details stood out. The lack of blood suggested the killer was in control and had taken time to clean or stage. The room Michael's body position indicated he may have been caught off guard. There were minor signs of a struggle near the bed, but not enough to indicate a lengthy The crime didn't seem random. Someone had come to that motel for a reason, and that reason was Michael Harrington. Detective Mitchell continued to scrutinize room 12, taking in every detail. The decor was sparse. A faded print of a desert landscape hung crookedly on one wall, and an old television sat atop a battered dresser. But something near the bed caught her eye. On the floor, crumpled and half hidden beneath the nightstand, was a small piece of paper. Mitchell retrieved it carefully. It was a handwritten note, scribbled hastily in ink. Just 5 chilling words. "I'll be back, don't leave." The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. The note felt personal, like a message meant for Michael. But if that was the case, who had written it? And why leave it behind? That cryptic message marked the beginning of a deeper, more disturbing investigation with Mitchell at the helm. The Glendale Police Department began unraveling the final days of Michael Harrington's life. The first task was to identify anyone Michael had been in contact with recently. Detectives interviewed friends, colleagues, and family members. But each conversation brought only more confusion. Michael had kept his personal life tightly guarded since his divorce. He had become increasingly withdrawn. Even those once close to him admitted that he seemed to be intentionally pushing people away. But a breakthrough came when detectives reviewed Michael's phone records. One name stood out. Taliesin. Cooper Allison was a century-year-old divorcee whom Michael had met months earlier during a business trip to Seattle. According to those close to them, the two had shared an intense and fast-burning romance for a while. They were inseparable, constantly calling, texting, and traveling to see each other. But that passion had eventually soured in the weeks before his death. Michael had become distant. Friends recalled how he seemed agitated and closed off. He had canceled plans with Allison and stopped returning her calls. Despite this, Allison had been persistently trying to reconnect, calling him repeatedly in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to salvage the relationship. Detective Mitchell visited Allison at her home. At first, she was cooperative, surprised, even shaken, when told of Michael's death. But as the questioning continued, her demeanor shifted. She became evasive and visibly anxious when asked about the note found at the crime scene. Allison's reaction was telling. She grew tense, avoided eye contact, and fumbled her words. Deeper look into Allison's history revealed troubling details. She had a documented history of mental health challenges, including depression and obsessive behavior. Her past relationships had been tumultuous, marked by emotional outbursts and allegations of stalking. Her ex-husband had filed complaints about heated custody battles, and several former partners described her as volatile and controlling. The signs pointed to a dangerous pattern, and Michael had become part of that pattern. Detectives learned that Allison had continued contacting Michael in the days leading up to his murder. She had even driven to Glendale without informing anyone. Investigators now believed that she had followed him to the Desert Breeze motel on the night of March 5. There, an argument broke out, one that turned violent in a fit of rage. Allison had slashed Michael's throat with a knife. She'd brought with her the minimal blood at the scene, suggested she may have used towels to stifle the bleeding, either to prevent detection or out of panic afterward. She penned the note, a final plea, a fractured attempt to hold on before fleeing the room in a distressed state. Mitchell's team soon located Allison's car, parked not far from the motel. Inside, Blood was found on the upholstery. Forensic testing confirmed it was Michael Harrington's. With this key evidence, Mitchell secured an arrest warrant. The woman who had once professed her love for Michael had, in the end, taken his life. Allison Cooper was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial became a media frenzy every day. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, eager for updates. Under pressure and facing overwhelming evidence, Allison eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She admitted to killing Michael in a moment of rage, expressing regret, but it was too little. Too late. The Glendale community mourned the loss of a man described by colleagues as quiet, kind, and hardworking. But more than mourning, they were forced to confront a brutal truth: that obsession, when left unchecked, can become deadly. Detective Mitchell's investigation had peeled back the layers of a relationship that, beneath its surface, had been steeped in control, desperation, and emotional manipulation. What had seemed to others like just another post-divorce fling was, in reality, a ticking time bomb. As Mitchell continued to dig into Michael's past, she began to understand the full emotional toll he had been carrying. Interviews with co-workers revealed that he was deeply private, committed to his job, but emotionally distant. His divorce had left wounds that never truly healed. Friends said he had begun spending more time alone, often at bars or out of town, seeking fleeting escapes from the loneliness. One friend, Tom, recalled a particularly haunting conversation just months before the murder. Michael had opened up about Allison. "She's just too much," he had said. "She loves me, but she doesn't know when to let go." Michael had even confided a deep fear: "I think she might hurt herself if I end it now." Those words rang with chilling clarity, not just as concern for her, but as an unspoken fear of what she might do to him. The final phase of Mitchell's investigation focused on mapping Allison's past behavior and how it had escalated over time. Part 3: Obsession, Control, and a Fatal Delusion. As Detective Mitchell dug further into Allison Cooper's past, what she uncovered was deeply unsettling. Adeline's sending pattern of obsessive behavior toward her ex-partners. Multiple individuals recounted how she would appear uninvited at their homes and workplaces, leave dozens of voicemails, often tearful, pleading, and emotionally erratic. Kent struggled to accept the end of a relationship. One of her former husbands, Robert Cooper, had even filed for a restraining order after their divorce, citing stalking and harassment, but the order was dismissed after a few months, with the court deeming her actions not serious enough to warrant legal intervention. Hindsight, it was clear that this behavior had gone unchecked for far too long, and Michael Harrington had unknowingly become her next fixation. As Mitchell connected the dots, a disturbing picture emerged: Allison's deep need for control and emotional validation seemed to intensify during her relationship with Michael. In the beginning, her passionate attention had appealed to him. Still reeling from his divorce, Michael was craving connection, and Allison provided that. But what started as an intense romance quickly spiraled into something darker. Friends described how Michael began expressing concern over Allison's unpredictable behavior. She would show up at his apartment without warning, often bearing flowers or gifts, insisting they could work things out. But when Michael attempted to set boundaries, Allison's mental state appeared to deteriorate further. One of Michael's co-workers, Jane, remembered a particularly troubling incident just weeks before his death. Michael had confided in her. "She showed up at my door, crying. She begged me not to leave her. Said she couldn't live without me. It was terrifying. I didn't know what to say." Michael had been trying to sever ties, but every attempt to distance himself was met with emotional manipulation, guilt trips, and veiled threats. The pressure was relentless. His decision to go no contact in the final days of his life wasn't just a breakup. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim control over his own existence. Detective Mitchell carefully reconstructed the timeline. It soon became evident that the confrontation at the Desert Breeze motel had not been spontaneous or random. It was the result of a long, escalating emotional breakdown. Allison had spent weeks trying to reconnect with Michael, but he had cut off all communication. That final rejection, paired with her already fragile mental state, pushed her over the edge on the night of March 5th. Allison drove to the motel, likely believing this was her last chance to make Michael understand the depth of her feelings. But when he calmly, firmly told her it was over for good, something inside her shattered, fueled by heartbreak, rage, and delusion. Allison attacked Michael in a violent outburst that ended his life. Her state of mind became even clearer during the subsequent police interrogation. At first, Allison denied everything. She claimed she hadn't seen Michael in days and insisted she'd been at home, trying to move on, but Detective Mitchell had already gathered damning evidence: Michael's blood in her car, the note found in the motel room, and testimony from witnesses who had seen her near the scene when confronted. Allison's composure crumbled, her story shifted, she grew defensive, and then, finally, she broke down and confessed. She admitted to going to the motel that night. She said she was overwhelmed by jealousy, desperation, and the fear of abandonment. She described the confrontation in an eerily detached tone, how Michael had rejected her again, how it triggered something uncontrollable inside her. She picked up the knife and lashed out in her words. She hadn't meant to kill him, but in the heat of the moment, the violence spiraled. Only after fleeing the scene did the reality of what she'd done set in, but even then, she tried to justify her actions to herself, telling investigators, "He pushed me to it." Her confession, though detailed and emotionally charged, did little to ease the pain of Michael's family and friends. The evidence was overwhelming, and the community struggled to make sense of a tragedy that had grown from the shadows of obsession and emotional control. Michael Harrington had been a man simply trying to move forward after a painful divorce. In the end, he was killed by someone he had once loved, someone who could not accept the end of their relationship. Allison Cooper was arrested and charged with first-degree murderers. The legal proceedings began. Even more disturbing details came to light through interviews and recovered evidence. Mitchell discovered that Allison's obsession had gone much deeper than anyone realized. She had been following Michael for weeks, visiting places he frequented, showing up at his office, watching from a distance. Several friends recalled spotting her near his apartment complex. She was always close, always watching. Then came a chilling revelation. Allison had kept a journal, a meticulously detailed account of her relationship with Michael. Every conversation, every phone call, every perceived slight, it was all documented to Mitchell. The journal was haunting. It painted a portrait of a woman who refused to accept reality in her mind. Their love was never over. Michael wasn't avoiding her, he was just confused. He would come back. He had toyed. Was as if she'd created an alternate world where the breakup didn't exist, where rejection was just a misunderstanding, where Michael still loved her, despite the growing evidence to the contrary. By the time she confronted him at the motel, that fantasy had collapsed, and in its place stood only rage, sorrow, and a dangerous sense of entitlement. One of the most heartbreaking elements of the investigation was the emotional toll on Michael. He had never stopped trying to do the right thing. His friends described him as kind, conflict-averse, and soft-spoken. He didn't want to hurt Allison. He wanted peace, but his empathy had made him vulnerable to guilt, to manipulation, and ultimately, to danger. Allison's behavior had crossed every line from emotional abuse to stalking, but Michael, hoping she would eventually let go, had chosen silence over confrontation. Tragically, that silence became fatal. Detective Mitchell's investigation uncovered not only the truth behind Michael's murder, but a much larger issue: how obsession, when unrecognized and unaddressed, can turn deadly. Allison Cooper's trial was set to begin. The community waited, still stunned, as the courtroom prepared to dissect the twisted dynamic that had ended in tragedy. Title: Obsession Turned Fatal, the Murder of Michael Harrington. What led to the fatal confrontation at the Desert Breeze Motel was a toxic cocktail of rejection, obsession, and emotional instability. Michael Harrington had made it unmistakably clear. He wanted nothing more to do with Allison Cooper. He had cut her off, refused her calls, ignored her texts, and even told mutual friends that the relationship was over for good. But, for Allison, that final rejection was unbearable. The encounter on the night of March 5th was Allison's last desperate attempt to reclaim what she believed was hers. She showed up at Michael's motel room, hoping for reconciliation or, at the very least, acknowledgement. When Michael opened the door, he was met with a tearful, volatile Allison. Their conversation turned into an argument almost instantly. Michael, still resolute, tried to explain that there was no future for them, but Allison wasn't in a state to listening to her later confession. She pleaded with him, begged him to reconsider. She told him she couldn't live without him, but when he refused again, something inside her snapped. The argument escalated in a moment of fury. Allison reached into her purse and pulled out a knife. Whether that knife had been carried with intent or brought out impulsively in a haze of desperation, one thing became clear: the attack was savage and swift. She slashed Michael's throat in a single, deadly motion. The wound was precise, too precise to be purely accidental, though she claimed it was spontaneous. The act suggested planning. As Michael struggled for life, Allison reportedly held him down to prevent resistance. The lack of blood splatter around the room hinted at her calculated approach, perhaps an effort to contain the chaos. Then, just as quickly, she fled, leaving behind a lifeless body and a nightmare that would scar two families forever. Aftermath and grief. The emotional fallout was devastating. Michael's two children, both teenagers, were left reeling. Their father, a quiet, hard-working man who had always been their rock, was gone. The loss was horrific enough, but the fact that it came at the hands of someone he had once loved and trusted made it even more unimaginable. Friends and family rallied around the children, helping them navigate the overwhelming grief. Yet nothing could erase the trauma, not just of losing Michael, but of how he had been taken. The image of Allison Cooper, once a familiar face in their lives, now stood as the embodiment of betrayal and destruction. Meanwhile, Allison's family was equally shaken. Her parents were haunted by guilt and disbelief. Her mother, in particular, was tormented by the signs she had missed: the obsessive tendencies, the emotional dependency. She had never imagined that the daughter she raised could be capable of such violence. The trial in court. Emotions ran high. Michael's family delivered heart-wrenching testimony about their pain and the deep void his death had left behind. Allison's defense team tried to portray her as a woman consumed by emotional instability, someone who acted out of heartbreak, not hatred. They argued for a manslaughter conviction, hoping the jury would view the killing as a crime of passion, but the prosecution saw it differently. They painted a picture of obsession that had fermented over time, a pattern of stalking behavior, manipulation, and emotional volatility. They argued that the knife in her purse wasn't just a coincidence, it was part of a plan A. Conscious decision to end a life that no longer wanted to be connected to hers. The jury deliberated for days. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Allison Cooper was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of 25 years to life. She would serve her time in prison, in isolation, haunted by what she had done. Lingering shadows in Glendale. The impact of Michael Harrington's murder, echoed long after the headlines faded. His death had become a chilling reminder of how love, when warped by obsession and emotional instability, can turn deadly. His children, Jason and Emily, struggled to rebuild their lives. Jason, the older of the two, poured himself into academics, determined to make his father proud. Emily, however, was left adrift, lost in a world that no longer made sense without the steady presence of her dad. For both, the trauma lingered, shaping how they viewed love, trust, and safety. The media had feasted on the trial, turning the courtroom into a battleground of narratives. Public opinion was divided. Was Allison a heartbroken woman pushed too far, or a calculating killer hiding behind tears? For Detective Sarah Mitchell, who had led the investigation, the case left a lasting scar. She had uncovered the truth, but there was no closure, only a reminder of the darkest corners of the human heart. It was a case that forced her to confront a painful truth, that even those closest to us can harbor dangerous emotions beneath the surface. Epilogue. Michael Harrington's death became more than a headline. it became a cautionary tale, a story of love twisted by control, of boundaries ignored, and of a tragedy that could have been prevented. The people of Glendale would never forget how one woman's refusal to accept the end of a relationship tore two families apart and stole a father from his children. The true tragedy wasn't just the murder, it was how a relationship, once filled with love, ended in bloodshed. Love turned fatal. The story of Michael Harrington. Conclusion to those who knew him. Michael Harrington's death was a haunting reminder. Even the most seemingly innocent relationships can turn dangerously toxic when emotions spiral out of control. His story became more than just a personal tragedy. It became a warning warning about the power of obsession, a warning about the importance of recognizing when love turns into possession, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who once held your heart. For those who survived him as children, his friends, his family, Michael's murder forced them to confront an unimaginable loss. It taught them how to grieve, how to rebuild, and how to move forward. Even with permanent emotional scars. As for Allison Cooper, her future remained uncertain. The prison walls around her weren't just made of concrete and steels, they were psychological barriers, trapping her with the consequences of her choices. Once a woman deeply in love, she now spent her days haunted by what that love had become. Her time in prison was marked by long, silent stretches of introspection, but redemption, if it was even possible, wouldn't come easily, because before she could ever hope to move forward, Allison would have to truly face the darkest parts of herself, the obsession, the loss of control, and the irreversible act that stole a man's life. No matter how much time passes, for those who loved Michael Harrington, his memory will never fade. He will be remembered not just as a victim, but as a man who tried to rebuild his life, only to be caught in the destructive force of a love gone terribly wrong. His death serves as a permanent reminder. The most devastating tragedies often grow from the most unexpected places. Story 8. A Silent Storm. The murder of Patrick Johnson in February 15, 2000. The quiet town of Buckley, Washington, was rocked by a brutal murder that shattered its sense of peace. The victim, 42-year-old Patrick Johnson, a father, a mechanic, and a beloved member of the community, was found dead in his home under horrific and suspicious circumstances. Patrick was known around Buckley as a kind, reserved man who kept to himself, but always lent a helping hand. He had a teenage daughter, Lily, and was well liked by neighbors. But behind the calm, suburban exterior, Patrick had been weathering a storm, one that no one saw coming, and one that would ultimately cost him his life. The investigation began when 16-year-old Lily Johnson called 911 in a state of panic. She had just come home from school to find her father's lifeless body sprawled across the living room floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Patrick was supposed to pick her up from school when he didn't show up. Lily walked home only to find the front door slightly open. From the moment she stepped inside, she felt something was horribly wrong. What she found would change her life forever when officers arrived. The scene was chaotic. Patrick had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, his skull was fractured, and he had defensive wounds on his hands, indicating he fought desperately for his life. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing appeared to be stolen. This was something personal. The investigation begins. Detective Erica Harland from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator, she quickly assessed that this wasn't a random act of violence. The broken glass at the front door suggested forced entry, but curiously, the house had been locked from the inside. As she moved through the modest home, Harland noted the signs of a struggle. Furniture overturned, shattered, a coffee table splintered near Patrick's body. Whatever happened had been violent and personal, but there were no obvious suspects, no forced entry beyond the damaged door, and no fingerprints or DNA that stood out. So Harland turned her focus to Patrick's personal life, hoping that somewhere in his recent past, she'd find answers. Lily's statement at a neighbor's house. Lily sat shaken and tearful, trying to comprehend what had happened. In a quiet conversation, Detective Harland asked her about her father's life over the past few months. According to Lily, Patrick had been struggling emotionally after a recent separation from her mother, Karen. Though the divorce had been amicable on the surface, Patrick had sunk into a quiet depression. He tried to stay strong for Lily, but the sadness was visible, was distant, tired, and often lost in thought. Then came Valerie. Patrick had recently begun seeing a woman named Valerie, someone he had met through a mutual friend. Lily described Valerie as warm, outgoing, and quick to win people over. Patrick seemed happier when she was around, but their relationship wasn't without tension. Lily recalled overhearing arguments between her father and Valerie, disagreements that turned into shouting matches. At the time, she thought little of it. Couples fight, she figured, but now, in the shadow of her father's murder, those memories took on a chilling new weight. In covering Valerie's past, Detective Harland began digging into Valerie's history, and what she found was alarming. Valerie had been married twice before. Both relationships had ended in reports, restraining orders, accusations of both emotional and physical abuse. In Buckley, whispers followed her name. She had a reputation for volatility, and those who knew her spoke carefully, some with fear, some with disdain. It didn't take long before Valerie became the prime focus of the investigation. When brought in for questioning, Valerie appeared nervous and on edge. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her answers were rehearsed. She insisted that she and Patrick were happy. Yes, they argued sometimes, but it was never serious. She had nothing to do with his death. But Detective Harland wasn't convinced. There was no forced entry beyond the damaged door. The killer had likely been someone. Patrick knew someone he let inside, and someone who felt comfortable enough in the house to move around without triggering any alarm. The more they investigated, the more Valerie's timeline began to crumble. Phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements all began to reveal gaps in her story, and behind those gaps lay the terrifying truth. Valerie insisted that she and Patrick shared a strong bond, that their connection had been meaningful and loving. She claimed she never intended for anything to spiral out of control. But as the interview continued, Detective Harland began noticing inconsistencies in her story. Valerie grew increasingly defensive when asked about arguments between her and Patrick, dismissing them as minor and insignificant, yet her body language told a different story. Evasive and clearly uncomfortable when pressed about the night of the murder. Initially, Valerie stated she had been home alone the night Patrick was killed, but after persistent questioning, she changed her story. She admitted that she had gone to Patrick's house around 7:30 p.m. to surprise him with a home-cooked dinner. According to her, the door was locked, and when no one answered, she decided to leave. As she was leaving, she claimed she saw someone in the driveway, but at the time she didn't think much of it. Detective Harland's instincts were sounding alarms. Shifting timeline didn't add up. The inconsistencies, coupled with her growing anxiety, made Harland believe that Valerie was hiding something. The next logical step was to obtain a warrant to search Valerie's home, hoping that something there would finally crack the case open. As investigators dug deeper, a much darker version of Valerie began to emerge, one hidden beneath her outward charm and confidence. What they found would confirm that Patrick Johnson's death wasn't just the result of a lover's quarrel, it was the end result of a deeply disturbed relationship. Detective Harland soon uncovered troubling accounts from Valerie's past. Several of her former partners were located and interviewed. One of them, Mark Delaney, her ex-husband, spoke openly about their volatile relationship. He said Valerie was magnetic at first, affectionate and lively, but once the honeymoon phase faded, her true nature surfaced. She became possessive and paranoid, constantly accusing him of cheating without any basis. Her temper, Mark said, was explosive. On one occasion, she hurled a glass at him during an argument, barely missing his face. The relationship ended when Mark filed for a restraining order and left town. Valerie's second marriage, to Tom Richardson, followed the same toxic pattern. Tom was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually admitted that Valerie's behavior had frightened him. He described frequent threats and episodes of emotional manipulation. After their breakup, he changed his phone number and moved to another city to escape her. He, too, had no idea just how far Valerie's instability could go until the investigation into Patrick's death began. Detective Harland also discovered that Valerie had moved frequently, never staying long in one place in each town she left behind. Whispers of broken relationships and fractured friendships. Those who knew her described her as charming until things didn't go her way. Then, they said, her warmth turned to rage. She was affectionate, but only on her terms. When disappointed or rejected, she lashed out with this growing pattern of behavior. Harland now viewed Valerie's relationship with Patrick through a more sinister lens. It wasn't a romance, it was a powder keg. Then came the discovery that would tie Valerie directly to the crime scene. Forensic investigators found a broken necklace beneath Patrick's body. It was a simple silver chain with a small pendant damaged during what appeared to be a violent struggle. The necklace was later confirmed to have belonged to Valerie when presented with the evidence. Valerie initially denied it was hers, but once confronted with the forensic report, she changed course. Admitting it was indeed her necklace, she insisted, however, that she had lost it weeks ago and had no idea how it ended up at Patrick's home. Detective Harland didn't believe her. The necklace's presence at the scene was more than coincidence. It was a clue left behind in the chaos of violence, and it contradicted Valerie's timeline completely. As the investigation closed in, Patrick's daughter, Lily, struggled to process the truth. Valerie had been someone she trusted, someone she had even begun to see as a maternal figure. Now, that same woman was the prime suspect in her father's brutal murder. The emotional weight was devastating still. Lily was determined to see justice served. She began to recall troubling moments from the past few months' arguments, flashes of jealousy, and Valerie's increasing possessiveness at the time. They had seemed like normal relationship disagreements. But now, viewed through the lens of grief and hindsight, they took on a more ominous meaning. As Lily recounted these memories, Detective Harland felt her suspicions solidifying into something stronger. A case built not only on physical evidence, but on a clear and chilling pattern of obsession, control, and emotional instability. And the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. After interviewing several neighbors, Detective Harland received the breakthrough she had been hoping for. A neighbor living across the street from Patrick Johnson reported seeing Valerie's car parked outside his home late on the night of the murder. According to the witness, Valerie was spotted walking briskly down the driveway before getting into her car and quickly driving away. What stood out to the neighbor was Valerie's demeanor. She appeared expressionless and hurried, almost as if she didn't want to be seen. This critical piece of information confirmed Harland's suspicions. Valerie had been lying about her whereabouts that night. Armed with the mounting evidence, the detective decided it was time to confront her once again in the interrogation room. Valerie's carefully crafted story began to crumble under the weight of the facts when Harland revealed that a witness had placed her at the crime scene, and that her necklace, confirmed to be hers, had been discovered beneath Patrick's body. Valerie's composure finally cracked. She broke down in tears, admitting that she had gone to Patrick's house that evening, but she maintained that her intention was not to hurt him. According to Valerie, she had wanted to talk things through. They could salvage what remained of their deteriorating relationship instead. Their conversation escalated into a heated argument, Valerie said. She felt overwhelmed by feelings of rejection and abandonment, consumed by jealousy and rage. She struck Patrick with a heavy object from the living room. She couldn't recall what happened next, only that something in her snapped hand. When the rage subsided, Patrick lay motionless on the floor. Panicked, Valerie fled the scene, unintentionally dropping her necklace, and later fabricating an alibi to protect herself following her confession. Valerie Cooper was arrested and charged with the murder of Patrick Johnson. News of her arrest stunned the community. Many struggled to reconcile the woman they knew, composed and sociable, with someone capable of such violence. The upcoming trial promised to be both lengthy and emotionally charged. But one fact had become undeniable. Valerie's crime stemmed from deep emotional instability, unchecked jealousy, and a disturbing history of toxic relationships. The case became a chilling reminder to the town of Buckley that beneath the surface of even the most familiar faces, dangerous secrets could hide. Patrick Johnson's memory lived on in the hearts of those who loved him, but for those who had once trusted Valerie, the tragedy served as a sobering lesson about the destructive power of love turned violent acts. Detective Harland continued building the case against Valerie. More evidence emerged, reinforcing what she had suspected all along. Valerie had gone to great lengths to cover her involvement, manipulating facts and leaning on her charm to deflect suspicion. But with witness testimonies mounting and the forensic findings painting a damning picture, her lies began to unravel completely. Forensic experts meticulously analyzed the crime. Seen blood spatter patterns on the walls, furniture, and floor revealed the brutal nature of the struggle. The autopsy confirmed that Patrick had died from blunt force trauma to the head, sustained from multiple blows. The murder weapon, it turned out, was a shattered lamp found at the scene, its metal frame stained with blood. The lamp, as it happened, had been a gift from Patrick's daughter, Lily. It wasn't something anyone would expect to become a weapon, but in that moment of fury, it was the closest object at hand. Lily, still reeling from the trauma of discovering her father's body, struggled with overwhelming grief. She had once considered Valerie a friend, someone she trusted. Accepting that this same woman had taken her father's life was almost too painful to bear. But despite her sorrow, Lily remained determined to seek justice. Slowly, she began recalling incidents she had previously dismissed, moments when Valerie shown signs of possessiveness and resentment, particularly when Patrick spent time with others. With every new recollection, the pieces of the puzzle became clearer. Valerie's behavior had been deteriorating for months, and her emotional volatility had begun to surface in increasingly disturbing ways. Detective Harland's deep dive into Valerie's past uncovered a troubling pattern. Valerie's relationships, romantic and otherwise, had repeatedly ended in turmoil. Her two previous marriages had been marred by allegations of emotional and physical abuse. Ex-husbands described her as controlling, jealous, and prone to explosive outbursts. One man had even fled the city to escape her obsessive behavior. Friends and colleagues of Patrick confirmed that they had noticed a change in him after he began dating Valerie. Once outgoing and warm, Patrick had become withdrawn and anxious when Valerie was around. He was on edge, tense, nervous, almost as though he were constantly walking on eggshells. These observations painted a picture of a man trying to navigate an increasingly suffocating relationship. Harland discovered that the murder had not been the result of a spontaneous altercation. It had been building for days. Valerie had been brooding over feelings of jealousy and abandonment, convinced that Patrick was slipping away from her. According to those closest to the couple, she had become obsessed with controlling every part of his life. In the end, it was this obsessive need for control, fueled by emotional instability and years of unresolved trauma, that drove Valerie Cooper to kill the man she claimed to love. For the people of Buckley, the case served as a stark reminder: even relationships that seem loving on the outside can harbor dangerous darkness beneath. And for Lily Johnson, though the loss of her father would never be undone, the truth had finally come to light. Then justice was on its way. Valerie Cooper's emotional instability had created a volatile mix of jealousy, obsession, and rage, one that ultimately ended in murder. During the trial, her defense team argued that the killing had been the result of a momentary lapse in control, a crime of passion rather than premeditation. But the prosecution presented a compelling and methodically built case. The broken lamp, the blood evidence, and testimonies from those who had witnessed Valerie's increasingly erratic behavior painted a different picture, one of deliberate escalation and intent. Valerie's refusal to accept rejection, her controlling tendencies, and a long history of manipulative relationships became central themes in the prosecution's argument. This was not a spontaneous act, it was the final, tragic chapter in a relationship poisoned by control and unchecked emotion. Lily Johnson, Patrick's daughter, bravely took the stand to speak about her father. Her testimony was raw and emotional. She spoke of their memories, his kindness, and the unbearable pain she endured after his death. Her words struck a chord with the jury, offering a glimpse into the life that had been so violently taken, and the grief left in its wake. She also spoke of Valerie not as the woman who once shared meals at their table, but as the person who had stolen her father from her. As the trial progressed, Valerie's demeanor began to unravel. The confidence she once exuded gave way to nervous fidgeting, darting glances, and emotional withdrawal. The mountain of evidence was impossible to ignore, and the defense's attempts to downplay her culpability fell flat. Her lack of remorse, her cold detachment only deepened public resentment. Eventually, after weeks of intense testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Valerie Cooper was found guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The conviction brought a measure of closure to Patrick's family, though no punishment could ever truly undo the trauma of what had happened in Buckley. The trial left a lasting mark. The quiet town was forced to reckon with the fact that a seemingly ordinary relationship had harbored such darkness. Patrick Johnson, a well-liked, soft-spoken man, had lost his life, not to a stranger, but to someone he once loved and trusted. For Lily, the trial was just the beginning of a long road to healing. The emotional scars would never fully fade, but she made a promise to herself to live in a way that honored her father's memory. And so, in the months that followed, Lily became an advocate for victims of domestic abuse. She spoke out about the subtle warning signs, the manipulation, and the devastating toll that emotionally abusive relationships can inflict. Hidden behind closed doors, every time she shared her story, the pain resurfaced. The memory of discovering her father's lifeless body, the shock, the confusion, it all came rushing back. But Lily refused to be consumed by grief. Instead, she used her experience to bring light to others still trapped in the shadows. With every victim she helped, she felt closer to her father, keeping his legacy alive through action. Detective Harland, too, was deeply affected by the case. It had been one of the most emotionally grueling investigations of her career. There were moments when she said herself, when she wondered if she was reading too much into the evidence or chasing shadows. But when Valerie's guilt finally came to light, Harlan felt both vindicated and profoundly saddened. Valerie Cooper had been a woman who wore a carefully constructed mask beneath her charm lay a deeply disturbed individual, someone whose need for control, validation, and emotional dominance had spiraled into fatal violence. Harlan knew that justice had been served in a courtroom, but she also knew that the true cost of Valerie's crime could never be quantified in years behind bars. Valerie had destroyed not only Patrick's life, but also her own and Lily's. Even in prison, it was unclear whether she would ever come to terms with the depth of her actions inside the penitentiary. The once charming Valerie quickly faded into obscurity. She was no longer the poised woman who had captivated those around her, but just another inmate, forgotten, discarded, and stripped of the illusion of power she once wielded. Her days became monotonous, spent mostly in isolation despite moments of introspection. Valerie remained largely incapable of accepting responsibility. She clung to justifications, painting herself as the victim of betrayal rather than the perpetrator of a horrific crime. But even among fellow inmates, her reputation preceded her. Women she once might have manipulated kept their distance. Her charm no longer worked. Her influence had evaporated as the years passed. Buckley slowly began to return to normal, but the shadow of Patrick Johnson's murder still lingered, a quiet reminder of how quickly darkness can seep into even the most familiar places. The town changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Conversations that had once been hushed grew louder. People talked more openly about jealousy, emotional abuse, and the hidden violence that can exist in toxic relationships. Valerie Cooper's trial had served as a brutal wake-up call. Lily, now older and more introspective, had come to terms with the fact that she would never fully escape the pain of losing her father, but she had also found strength in his memory through her advocacy. She continued to transform her grief into something meaningful. She gave voice to the voiceless and hope to those who thought they had none, though her father's death had stolen so much from her. It had also ignited a purpose, a mission to protect others from the same fate. She understood now that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry your past without letting it define your future. And Patrick Johnson's memory lived on not only in Lily's heart, but in the lives she touched through her courage, her strength, and her unwavering pursuit of justice. Who had loved Patrick Johnson kept his memory alive through meaningful action. Friends and family rallied around the causes he had once championed, determined that his death would not be in vain. While no one could ever forget the horrific circumstances of his murder, they chose to remember the man behind the tragedy. A kind, loving father devoted to his daughter, they honored Patrick, not only through mourning, but through purpose, channeling their grief into advocacy and awareness to help prevent others from suffering the same fate. His life, though tragically cut short, became a powerful symbol of resilience and a catalyst for conversations long left unspoken about emotional abuse, manipulation, and the danger of unchecked jealousy. Lily, now grown, had become a voice for those silenced by fear and shame. Her tireless advocacy gave meaning to her loss, turning pain into progress through support groups, speaking engagements, and outreach programs. She offered hope where once there was only sorrow. Each step forward was a tribute to her father, not erasing the pain, but transforming it into strength. Detective Harrand, too, carried the memory of the case with her, though she had moved on to new investigations. The murder of Patrick Johnson had left a lasting imprint on her, a case that reminded her how fragile human relationships could be, and how deep the wounds ran when love turned to control and rage. Healing, for Lily and for the town of Buckley, was a gradual process. The wound of Patrick's death would never fully close, but it no longer defined them. As the years passed, life moved on, yet the echoes of the past lingered, a quiet, persistent reminder of what had been lost and what had been learned. The tragedy forced Buckley to confront the often invisible signs of domestic turmoil and emotional instability. It became a turning point for the community, awakening a collective awareness that some of the deadliest dangers are those that lie behind closed doors. Through Lily's efforts and the community's resilience, Patrick's story lived on, not only as a tale of tragedy, but as a force for change.